The moment my own family destroyed me in front of 200 guests, they sealed their fate. At my sister's lavish wedding, my parents handed me a suitcase and coldly demanded I leave the family home forever. "This house belongs to Bella now," my father announced to the crowd. "Leave the key and get out." The humiliation was designed to break me. My mother's eyes were ice cold as she whispered, "You were always the disappointment." The entire high society crowd watched as I was cast out like garbage, my sister smirking in her designer wedding dress. But here's what they didn't know: my grandfather Charles had been playing a much longer game. 3 days later, my phone rang. "Ms. Grace, this is First National Bank. We need to discuss your inheritance. You're listed as the sole owner of the Grace estate." Sole owner of everything. The same people who'd just humiliated me in front of their entire social circle were about to discover they'd been living in my house this whole time. The fortress of wealth and status they'd used to crush me, it was mine. What happened next will shock you, because when a family destroys the wrong daughter, when they underestimate the quiet one who's been watching and learning, the revenge isn't just sweet, it's absolutely devastating. My father would soon be on his knees begging. My golden child sister would lose everything that made her special. And my mother, she'd finally understand what it feels like to be invisible. They created a monster. Now they were about to meet her. Stay with me because you won't believe how this story ends. My name is Evelyn Grace, and at 32 years old, I've learned that sometimes the greatest victories come from the deepest wounds. As a financial analyst who built her career from nothing, I thought I understood the mathematics of loss and gain. But nothing in my spreadsheets could have prepared me for the equation my family would present me with at my sister's wedding. To understand how that moment came to define everything you have to know about the shadows that shaped my childhood in our pristine Connecticut suburb. Growing up in the Grace household was like living in a museum where I was the exhibit nobody wanted to see. Our colonial mansion sat perfectly manicured on Elm Street, surrounded by other wealthy families who measured their worth in country club memberships and charity galas. Inside those walls, my parents, Richard and Margaret, had already decided which daughter deserved the spotlight, and it certainly wasn't me. Bella was 3 years older, and everything I could never be in their eyes. While I spent hours hunched over textbooks and science experiments, she drifted through life with the confidence of someone who knew she was loved unconditionally. When Bella brought home a poem for English class copied word for word from a collection she'd found in the library, my mother Margaret would frame it and hang it prominently in the hallway. "Look how creative our Bella is." She'd coo to visitors, never mentioning that I'd won the regional science fair 3 years running. The pattern became so predictable it felt choreographed. Bella would achieve something mediocre, and my parents would react as if she'd cured cancer. Meanwhile, my academic achievements collected dust in my bedroom. The certificates from math competitions, the ribbons from debate tournaments, the letters from teachers praising my analytical mind, none of it seemed to register in their universe where Bella was the sun and I was barely a distant planet. I remember one particular afternoon when I was 14, rushing home with my heart pounding with excitement. I'd just won first place at the state science fair with my project on renewable energy applications. The judges had called it remarkably sophisticated for a student her age, and I couldn't wait to share the news with my family. I burst through the front door, clutching my trophy, practically vibrating with pride and anticipation. But the house was already in chaos. Margaret was running around with party planners, transforming our dining room into what looked like a princess palace. Pink streamers hung from every surface, and an enormous cake sat in the center of the table, decorated with Bella's name in elaborate gold script. It was my sister's 16th birthday party, and apparently nothing else in the world mattered. "Mom, look what I won!" I called out, holding up my trophy as Margaret rushed past me with an armload of pink roses. She barely glanced in my direction, her attention consumed by the exact placement of centerpieces. "That's nice, dear," she said absently, then immediately turned to the florist. No, the roses need to be higher. Bella specifically requested dramatic height for the arrangements." I stood there for what felt like hours watching my mother orchestrate every detail of Bella's celebration, while my trophy grew heavy in my hands. When I tried again to show her the first-place ribbon, she shushed me. "Not now, Evelyn. Can't you see we're busy? This is important." That word important hit me like a physical blow. My achievement wasn't important. My excitement didn't matter. In that moment, I felt myself becoming invisible, not just overlooked, but actively erased from the narrative of my own family's life. The only person who ever seemed to truly see me was my grandfather, Charles. Where my parents saw disappointment, he saw potential. Charles Grace had built a business empire from nothing, and he understood the value of persistence and intelligence over superficial charm. He would visit every few weeks, and while my parents fawned over Bella's latest trivial accomplishment, he would seek me out in my room where I'd be working on homework or reading. "Evelyn," he'd say, settling into the chair by my desk, "tell me what you're learning." And he would actually listen, really listen, asking thoughtful questions about my projects, and nodding approvingly when I explained complex concepts. He never made me feel like I was bothering him or taking up space. On my 15th birthday, when my parents had forgotten to buy me a gift while planning Bella's upcoming graduation party, Charles presented me with something that would stay with me forever. It was a small wooden box carved with intricate patterns and polished to a rich mahogany shine. Inside, the lid burned in elegant script were the words, "Power lies in patience." This box belonged to my father. Charles told me, his weathered hands gentle as he placed it in my palms. He taught me that true strength doesn't come from being the loudest or the most praised. It comes from endurance, from watching, and from waiting for the right moment to act. Some battles are won quickly, Evelyn, but the most important ones require patience. He would tell me stories about justice, not the swift justice of movies, but the slow, inevitable justice that comes to those who persist. He spoke of business deals that took years to come to fruition, of competitors who underestimated the quiet ones, of victories that were all the sweeter because they were earned through perseverance rather than given freely. But he passed away before I understood how much I would need him. 17 years had passed since Charles left me that wooden box, and I carried his lessons with me as I walked through the gates of Meadowbrook Country Club on what would become the most defining day of my life. The venue my parents had chosen for Bella's wedding was everything you'd expect from Connecticut's elite rolling emerald lawns that stretched toward Long Island Sound, a clubhouse that looked like it had been transplanted from an English estate, and an atmosphere so thick with old money you could practically taste the silver spoons. The morning air carried the scent of white roses and gardenias as golf carts ferried guests from the valet stand to the ceremony site. I watched Bentleys and Mercedes pull up in an endless parade, disgorging Connecticut's most prominent families in their designer finery. These were the people who summered in the Hamptons, whose children attended Ivy League schools as a birthright, whose approval my parents had spent decades courting. Today, they would all witness Richard and Margaret Grace presenting their masterpiece to society. Inside the clubhouse, I could see my parents holding court in the marble-floored lobby, their faces glowing with pride as they greeted each arrival. Margaret wore a stunning champagne-colored silk dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon. Richard stood beside her in his perfectly tailored morning coat, his chest puffed out like a peacock displaying his plumage. They moved through the crowd with practiced grace, air-kissing the wives of bank presidents and shaking hands with senior partners from white-shoe law firms. "The Graces certainly know how to throw a wedding," I heard one woman comment to her husband as they passed me on the terrace. "Margaret's been planning this for 2 years. She says Bella is the jewel of their family." The ceremony site had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. Hundreds of white chairs arranged in perfect rows faced an altar draped in cascading white flowers and greenery. Crystal chandeliers hung from temporary pavilion structures, catching the morning light and casting rainbows across the assembled guests. A string quartet played softly as people found their seats. the music drifting across manicured gardens where peacocks wandered freely. I found my assigned seat and understood immediately that even the seating chart was a message. Table 12 sat in the far corner, partially obscured by a massive floral arrangement, and positioned uncomfortably close to the service station where waitstaff would be bustling throughout the reception. While the front rows filled with my parents' closest friends and business associates, I was surrounded by distant cousins plus ones who barely knew the family and elderly relatives who'd been relegated to what was clearly the equivalent of social Siberia. "Oh, you must be Evelyn," said the woman seated next to me, squinting at my place card. She was my father's second cousin, from somewhere in Massachusetts, someone I'd met perhaps twice in my entire life. "I haven't seen you since you were, 12? You were always so serious. Not like Bella. She was always the social butterfly, wasn't she?" The comments began almost immediately whispered conversations that weren't quite meant for me to hear, but weren't exactly private either. The woman across from me leaned toward her companion, her voice carrying just enough for me to catch every word. "I always wondered about the younger Grace daughter. Such a shame she never found her place like Bella did. Some children just don't have that special something, you know." Another relative, an older man whose name I couldn't remember, shook his head sadly as he watched Bella float down the aisle in her $1,000 dress. "Richard and Margaret must be so proud. At least one of their daughters turned out to be everything they hoped for. Not every family is so fortunate." I sat through the ceremony watching my parents beam with unmistakable pride. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief during the vows, while Richard's smile seemed permanently fixed in place. They had positioned themselves in the front row, where everyone could see their joy, their satisfaction at presenting their perfect daughter to Connecticut society. When the minister pronounced Bella and her investment banker husband, man, and wife, the applause was thunderous, and I could see my parents practically glowing as they accepted congratulations from their peers. During the cocktail hour, I made several attempts to connect with my family, hoping that perhaps the joy of the occasion might soften the invisible barriers that had always existed between us. I approached my father as he stood with a group of his golf partners, all of them holding crystal tumblers of what I assumed was his favorite scotch. "Dad," I said, touching his elbow gently. "The ceremony was beautiful. You and Mom must be so happy." He turned toward me with a look of mild irritation, as if I'd interrupted something important. His friends continued their conversation around us, discussing market projections and their latest real estate investments, but I could feel their attention shift momentarily to our exchange. "Evelyn," he said with forced politeness, the kind of tone you'd use with an acquaintance whose name you couldn't quite remember. "Yes, well, it's Bella's day, isn't it?" He glanced back toward his companions, clearly eager to return to their discussion. "I was hoping we could talk," I continued, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's been so long since we've had a real conversation, and seeing the family together like this." "Not today." Richard cut me off, his voice sharp enough that his golf partners fell silent. "Please don't ruin Bella's special day with whatever this is about. Can't you see I'm busy?" The dismissal hit me like a physical slap. His friends exchanged glances, some looking embarrassed by the awkwardness, others seeming almost satisfied by the drama. I felt heat rise in my cheeks as I realized that my own father had just publicly dismissed me in front of his social circle, treating me like an inconvenient interruption, rather than his daughter. I retreated back to my corner table, the sting of his words following me across the terrace. The reception was in full swing now, with guests mingling on the lawn while waiters circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. From my isolated vantage point, I watched my family work the crowd like the seasoned social operators they were. Margaret's laughter ringing across the garden as she shared stories about Bella's childhood, Richard accepting hearty congratulations on his successful daughter's brilliant match. As the sun began to set and the dinner service commenced, I realized that I hadn't had a single meaningful conversation with anyone all day. The relatives at my table continued their stream of backhanded observations about my life, comparing my quiet career to Bella's glamorous social presence, wondering aloud why I'd never married, speculating about my prospects with the casual cruelty that only family can manage. When the time came for toasts, I watched my father stand at the head table, his face flushed with pride and champagne. The entire reception fell silent, 200 guests turning their attention to Richard Grace as he prepared to honor his daughter. He looked resplendent in the golden light of the setting sun, every inch the successful patriarch celebrating his greatest achievement. Then my father raised his wine glass and destroyed me with just one toast. The crystal glass caught the light from the chandeliers as Richard held it aloft, his voice carrying across the hushed terrace with the practiced confidence of a man accustomed to commanding attention. "Friends, family, esteemed colleagues." He began, his tone warm and expansive as he gazed out over the sea of expectant faces. "Margaret and I have been blessed beyond measure by our daughter Bella's presence in our lives." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd as guests raised their own glasses, smiling indulgently at what they expected would be a typical father-of-the-bride toast. I sat frozen at my corner table, something cold and sharp beginning to form in my stomach as I watched my father's expression shift into something more calculating, more deliberate than simple paternal pride. "Bella has always been the shining light of the Grace family." Richard continued, his voice growing stronger, more ceremonial. "From the time she was a little girl, we knew she possessed that rare combination of grace, intelligence, and social acumen that marks true leadership. She has never disappointed us, never wavered in her commitment to the values and traditions that have made our family what it is today." The praise flowed like honey, each word carefully chosen to paint Bella as the perfect daughter, the ideal heir to the Grace legacy. I found myself gripping my napkin so tightly that my knuckles had turned white, watching as my sister beamed beside her new husband, basking in the golden spotlight of our father's approval. "Which is why..." Richard's voice rose to carry to every corner of the reception. "Margaret and I have made a decision that reflects not just our love for Bella, but our confidence in her future. The Grace family home, the house that has sheltered 5 generations of our family, will belong to Bella. She is the perfect heir to carry on our legacy, the daughter who has proven herself worthy of this responsibility." The words hit me like a physical blow, each syllable driving deeper than the last. Around the reception, heads nodded approvingly. Glasses clinked in celebration, and I heard the murmur of voices expressing their satisfaction with this obviously wise decision. "Of course Bella should inherit," someone whispered nearby. "She's clearly the successful one." Another voice added, "The younger daughter never really fit in anyway." My father wasn't finished. He seemed to grow taller as he spoke, his chest swelling with the satisfaction of a man making a grand pronouncement before his peers. "This decision represents more than just property transfer," he declared, his words carrying the weight of absolute finality. "It represents the continuation of everything the Grace name stands for in our community. Bella and her husband will raise their children in that house. We'll host the gatherings that maintain our family's position. We'll ensure that the Grace legacy continues to flourish for generations to come." The applause was thunderous, a wave of sound that seemed to crash over me from all directions. I sat motionless as 200 people celebrated what amounted to my complete erasure from the family narrative. This wasn't just about a house or an inheritance. This was my father publicly declaring that I had no place in the Grace family future, that I was so fundamentally inadequate that I couldn't be trusted with any part of our heritage. As the clapping died down and conversations resumed, I noticed Margaret making her way toward my table with purposeful strides. She carried herself with the same regal bearing she'd maintained all day, but there was something different in her expression now, a cold determination that made my blood run cold. In her hands she carried a small overnight bag, the kind you might pack for a brief business trip. "Evelyn," she said when she reached my table, her voice pitched low enough that only the immediate surrounding guests could hear, "I think it's time for you to go." The suitcase landed on the table with a soft thud, and I stared at it in complete bewilderment. The black leather was expensive but practical, and I could see that it had been packed with care. Someone had taken the time to fold clothes neatly to include toiletries and essentials. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was premeditated, planned, calculated. "What is this?" I managed to whisper, though some part of me already knew the answer. Margaret's smile was as cold as winter moonlight. "Your father and I have discussed this at length," she said, loud enough now that the nearby tables had fallen silent, their occupants leaning in to catch every word of what was clearly becoming a family drama. "With Bella inheriting the house, there's really no reason for you to continue living there. We've packed some of your things, and we think it would be best if you found your own place." The words seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet space around us. I was aware of faces turning toward our table of whispered conversations, stopping mid-sentence of the growing circle of attention focused on my humiliation. This wasn't a private family discussion. This was a public execution performed before an audience of Connecticut's social elite. "You want me to leave?" I asked, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears. "Tonight, during Bella's wedding reception." "We think it sends the right message," Margaret replied smoothly, her hands clasped in front of her as if she were discussing the weather. "Clean breaks are always best, don't you think? No need to draw things out or make them more complicated than necessary." I looked around the table at the faces staring back at me, some shocked, some embarrassed, but more than a few wearing expressions of satisfied curiosity, as if they were witnessing exactly the kind of family scandal they'd hoped to see at tonight's event. The elderly cousin, who'd been making snide comments all evening, looked positively delighted, her eyes bright with the prospect of gossip she could share for months to come. "This is unbelievable," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I realized that it wasn't unbelievable at all. This was the logical conclusion of 32 years of systematic dismissal, the final act in a play that had been building toward this moment since the day I was born. Margaret's expression didn't soften. "The car service has been arranged," she said with the same tone she might use to discuss dinner reservations. "Your ride will be waiting by the main entrance in 10 minutes. I stood slowly, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me, and reached for the suitcase handle. The leather was smooth and cool under my fingers, and I found myself thinking absurdly about how much this particular bag probably cost, how my mother had chosen it specifically for this moment of casting me out. The whispers followed me as I made my way toward the clubhouse fragments of conversation that cut like glass. "Can you believe it? Right at the wedding. The poor thing. Well, she never really belonged anyway. Bella was always the special one. Some families just have to make hard choices." I could feel their eyes on my back as I walked across the terrace past the dance floor, where couples were beginning to sway to the string quartet past the bar, where guests continued their celebrations, past the head table where Bella sat radiant in her wedding dress, apparently unaware or unconcerned that her sister was being banished from the family. The main entrance of Meadowbrook Country Club was lit by elegant lanterns, and sure enough, a black sedan waited by the circular drive. The driver, a middle-aged man in a crisp uniform, stepped out and opened the rear door for me without meeting my eyes. He'd clearly been briefed on the situation and knew better than to ask questions. As I slid into the leather seat and placed the suitcase beside me, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the car window. I looked exactly like what I was, a woman who had just been publicly discarded by her own family, dismissed as easily as an employee who'd outlived their usefulness. My carefully applied makeup had smudged slightly. My hair had come loose from its pins, and my dress, which I'd chosen so carefully that morning, now felt like a costume for a role I'd never been meant to play. I walked out of that party with empty hands, or so they thought. The sedan dropped me off at the edge of downtown Greenwich, and I found myself standing alone on the sidewalk as the taillights disappeared into the night. The suitcase felt heavier with each step as I began walking aimlessly through the familiar streets of my childhood, past the boutiques where my mother used to shop for Bella's clothes, past the restaurant where my family celebrated every milestone that didn't involve me, past the park, where I used to escape when the house became too suffocating. Each block brought a fresh wave of memories. Each one, a small knife twisting in the wound my parents had just inflicted. I remembered Christmas morning when I was 16, sitting alone in my room while the family exchanged gifts in the living room below. Margaret had claimed they'd simply forgotten to include me in the gift exchange, but I'd found the wrapped presents hidden in the back of her closet, weeks later presents that were never given, never acknowledged, never explained. The message had been clear: Christmas was for the real family, not for the disappointment upstairs. The streets were quieter now, most of the evening social events winding down, and I found myself drawn toward the residential area where our house stood. Not my house anymore, I reminded myself bitterly. Bella's house. The thought made my stomach clench with a mixture of rage and disbelief. I passed the Morrisons' estate where Bella had attended countless pool parties during high school events, to which I was never invited despite living just 3 doors down. "It would be awkward having you there," Bella had explained once when I asked why. "You don't really fit in with my friends." My feet carried me past the Hendricks mansion where I remembered hiding behind their garden wall one evening when I was 14, watching through the windows as my own family attended a dinner party. I'd walked the 4 miles home from school that day to find the house empty except for a note from Margaret explaining that they'd been invited to an intimate family gathering and suggesting I heat up leftovers for dinner. The intimate family gathering, as I discovered that evening, included the Hendricks, the Washingtons, and half a dozen other families from our social circle. Just not me. The memory of standing in that cold garden watching my parents laugh and socialize, while I shivered outside like some kind of ghost, brought tears to my eyes that I hadn't allowed myself to shed at the wedding. How many times had they done this? How many social events, family gatherings, important moments had they simply erased me from as if I didn't exist? I found myself on Oak Street, just 2 blocks from the family house, when another memory surfaced with painful clarity. Bella had been 19, home from college for the summer, and she'd been dating a boy named Jonathan whose family owned half of Greenwich's waterfront property. I'd been in the kitchen making myself a sandwich when he'd arrived for their date, and I'd made the mistake of saying hello and introducing myself as Bella's sister. Margaret had appeared within seconds, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. "Evelyn, go to your room immediately," she'd hissed, then turned to Jonathan with a bright smile. "I'm so sorry about that interruption. You know how it is with household staff. They sometimes forget their place." Household staff. She'd referred to her own daughter as household staff, rather than acknowledge my relationship to the family in front of Bella's wealthy boyfriend. The humiliation had burned so deeply that I'd stayed in my room for 3 days, claiming illness to avoid facing anyone. I stopped walking and set the suitcase down on the sidewalk, my hands shaking with exhaustion and emotion. Above me, the street lamps cast long shadows through the oak trees, and the silence of the wealthy neighborhood felt oppressive, as if even the air itself was judging me for my failure to belong. That's when I remembered the wooden box tucked away in my apartment across town, the one possession that had always felt truly mine. Charles's gift with its mysterious inscription, and the weight of his belief in me. Without fully realizing what I was doing, I hailed a taxi and gave the driver my address, clutching the suitcase like a lifeline as we drove through the empty streets. My apartment was a small 1-bedroom in a converted Victorian house, nothing like the grand estate I'd grown up in, but the first place I'd ever felt like I could breathe freely. I fumbled with my keys, my fingers still trembling from the evening's trauma, and finally made it inside, where I collapsed onto my couch with the wooden box in my lap. The carved surface was smooth under my fingers as I traced the familiar patterns Charles had shown me so many times. Inside, beneath the velvet lining, was the folded piece of paper I'd read 100 times over the years, but had never truly understood. His handwriting was elegant despite his age, each letter formed with the careful precision of a man who chose his words deliberately. "Justice is slow but never fails," the note read, just as I remembered. But tonight, those words seemed to pulse with new meaning, as if Charles had somehow known this moment would come, and had left me exactly what I needed to survive it. I could almost hear his voice reading the words, could picture his weathered hands holding mine as he explained that patience wasn't weakness, it was strategy. The stories he'd told me came flooding back with crystalline clarity. The competitor who'd tried to bankrupt his first business through underhanded tactics only to find himself ruined when Charles's methodical documentation led to a federal investigation 3 years later. The social climber who'd publicly humiliated Charles at a charity event, dismissing him as new money, who eventually found herself ostracized from every organization in the city when her own financial improprieties came to light. The people who hurt you carelessly. Charles had told me, always assume you'll accept it quietly. They count on your silence, your compliance, your willingness to disappear. But silence can be the most powerful weapon of all, Evelyn. It gives you time to watch, to learn to plan. I stood up and walked to the window overlooking the street, still holding the note. In the distance, I could see the lights of the country club where my family was probably still celebrating toasting Bella's future while congratulating themselves on how cleanly they'd disposed of the inconvenient daughter. They thought they'd solved their problem, eliminated the reminder of their own cruelty by simply making me vanish. The rage that had been building all evening finally crystallized into something cold and sharp and purposeful. They had made me invisible in my own home, treated me as less than human while elevating Bella to the status of a goddess. They had dismissed my achievements, ignored my pain, and finally cast me out like garbage in front of 200 witnesses. But they had made one critical error in their calculations. They had underestimated exactly who Charles Grace had been training all those years and what he had been preparing me to become. Standing there in my small apartment, surrounded by the life I'd built despite their neglect, I made an oath to the darkness and to the memory of the only person who'd ever believed in me. My family would learn that invisibility could be a choice, that silence could be a strategy, and that the daughter they'd thrown away so carelessly was far more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. That night the phone rang, and everything changed. The phone's shrill ring cut through the silence of my apartment at exactly 11:47 that night, jarring me from the dark thoughts that had been circling through my mind like vultures. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was some telemarketer or wrong number, but something about the persistence of the caller made me reach for the receiver on the fourth ring. "Miss Grace, this is Harrison Webb from First National Bank of Connecticut. I apologize for calling so late, but I've been trying to reach you all evening regarding an urgent matter concerning your inheritance." The word inheritance hit me like a physical blow. I sank back onto my couch, clutching the phone with suddenly sweaty fingers. "I think you have the wrong person," I managed to say. "My family made it quite clear tonight that I'm not inheriting anything." There was a pause on the other end, followed by the sound of papers rustling. "Miss Evelyn Grace, born March 15, 1991, daughter of Richard and Margaret Grace, granddaughter of Charles Frederick Grace." "Yes, that's me, but—" "Then there's no mistake," Mr. Webb interrupted, his voice taking on a more formal tone. "I'm calling to inform you that as of 6 months ago, upon the activation of certain clauses in your grandfather's will, you are now the sole legal owner of the Grace family estate at 247 Elm Street, Greenwich. Additionally, you are the beneficiary of what we call the Charles Grace Protection Trust, an offshore fund currently valued at approximately $4.7 million. The room seemed to tilt around me. I gripped the phone harder, certain I'd misheard. "That's impossible. My grandfather died when I was 15. That was 17 years ago." "Yes, Miss Grace, but your grandfather was quite specific about the timing of these revelations. His instructions were that you should only be informed of this inheritance if certain conditions were met, specifically if your immediate family attempted to disinherit you or remove you from the family home. Our law firm has been monitoring the situation as instructed, and tonight's events at your sister's wedding reception triggered the activation protocols." My mind reeled as I tried to process what he was telling me. Charles had somehow known 17 years ago that this night would come, that my parents would eventually cast me out so completely that legal intervention would be necessary. "Mr. Webb," I said slowly, "are you telling me that my grandfather predicted my family would betray me?" "Your grandfather was a very astute man, Miss Grace. His instructions were quite detailed regarding what he called the inevitable conclusion of Richard's poor judgment. He established this trust through our independent firm specifically to ensure your family could never interfere with your inheritance, regardless of any changes they might make to their own wills or property arrangements. I thought about the scene at the country club, my father's grand announcement about the house belonging to Bella, my mother's prepared suitcase. They had been so confident, so certain of their power to simply erase me from the family legacy. If only they knew that their authority over the Grace estate had been an illusion for nearly 2 decades. "There's something else, Miss Grace," Mr. Webb continued. "Your grandfather left specific instructions that upon activation of this inheritance, you should examine his personal effects more carefully. He mentioned something about additional guidance hidden in plain sight." After hanging up the phone, I sat in stunned silence for nearly an hour, staring at Charles's wooden box, as if it might suddenly sprout wings and fly away. The reality of what I'd just learned seemed too enormous to grasp. Not only did I own the house my family had just claimed for Bella, but I had access to millions of dollars they didn't even know existed. With trembling fingers, I opened the box once more, this time examining every inch with the desperate attention of an archaeologist uncovering ancient secrets. The velvet lining looked ordinary enough, but when I pressed along the edges, I discovered that one corner lifted slightly. Underneath, fitted into a shallow compartment I'd never noticed before, was a sealed envelope marked with my name in Charles's distinctive handwriting. Inside the envelope was a letter, unlike anything I'd expected, written in a combination of regular text and what appeared to be a simple numerical code. The decoded portions revealed themselves as I worked through the pattern Charles had taught me during those long afternoons in his study when he'd challenged me with puzzles and riddles. "My dear Evelyn," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then the family has finally shown their true colors completely. I am not surprised, merely disappointed that it took them so long to reveal the depth of their cruelty. But their loss will be your gain, and justice will finally have its day." The letter went on to detail a network of contacts Charles had cultivated over the years, people who owed him favors, professionals who respected his judgment, individuals positioned throughout Connecticut's business and social circles who had been quietly instructed to assist me when the time came. There was a private investigator who specialized in financial fraud, a journalist who had been waiting for the right story about high society corruption, even a real estate attorney who had been monitoring property transfers in Greenwich for irregularities. "You see, my dear," Charles had written, "I have been playing a much longer game than anyone realized. Every slight against you, every moment of neglect and cruelty has been carefully documented by people who understand the value of patience and precision. Your family believes they hold all the cards, but they have been playing with a stacked deck for years." The final paragraph sent chills down my spine. "Remember that justice is not about becoming the monster that hurt you. It is about ensuring that truth finally sees the light, that consequences finally catch up with actions, and that the innocent are finally protected from those who would abuse their power. You have been my knight in this game, Evelyn, but now it is time for you to become the queen." As I sat there reading and rereading Charles's words, I began to understand the true scope of what he had prepared for me. This wasn't just about money or property. This was about a systematic dismantling of the illusions my family had built their lives upon. Charles had spent years quietly gathering intelligence, building relationships, and positioning resources, all in preparation for the day when I would need to defend myself against the people who should have protected me. I walked to the window and looked out at the sleeping town, thinking about my parents. Probably still at the country club, toasting their successful disposal of their inconvenient daughter. Tomorrow they would wake up expecting to begin their new life with Bella as the sole heir, never suspecting that their actions had triggered a series of events set in motion nearly 2 decades ago. Charles had taught me about patience, about watching and waiting for the right moment to act. He'd prepared me for this battle in ways I was only beginning to understand, giving me not just the weapons I would need, but the army to wield them effectively. I didn't just hold the house. I held the entire chessboard they never knew existed. The coded letter had referenced one final piece of the puzzle, something Charles called the complete record. And it wasn't until I examined the wooden box under my desk lamp that I discovered another hidden compartment along the bottom edge. This one contained a small leather-bound journal, no bigger than my palm, filled with Charles's meticulous handwriting dating back nearly 20 years. As I opened to the first page, I realized I was holding the true chronicle of my family's moral decay, documented by the one man who had been watching it all unfold. The early entries painted a picture I'd never fully grasped as a child. Charles had initially been proud of Richard's marriage to Margaret, viewing their union as a strategic alliance that would strengthen the Grace family's position in Connecticut society. But his optimism had quickly soured as he watched them transform from ambitious young adults into something far more calculating and cruel. Richard has begun using Evelyn as a tool to make Bella appear more accomplished by comparison. One entry from my 10th birthday read, "Today, he praised Bella's mediocre watercolor painting while ignoring Evelyn's science fair trophy sitting on the same table." Margaret encouraged this behavior, claiming it would motivate Evelyn to try harder. They are systematically destroying one child to elevate the other. Page after page revealed the careful documentation of my parents' emotional abuse recorded by a grandfather who had been powerless to intervene directly without risking complete estrangement from the family. Charles had watched Margaret exclude me from family photographs, claiming I never smiled right. He'd witnessed Richard's business associates asking about his granddaughters, only to hear him respond as if he had only one child worth mentioning. The financial records I've reviewed show that Richard and Margaret have spent over $300,000 of family money on Bella's private schools, tutoring, and social activities over the past 5 years. Read an entry from my 14th birthday. Meanwhile, Evelyn received a $20 gift card for her academic achievements. They are literally investing in one daughter's future while starving the other of resources and attention. The journal revealed the true scope of my parents' exploitation of Charles's wealth. They had positioned themselves as the grateful caretakers of the family patriarch, all while systematically draining resources to fund their lavish lifestyle. The European vacations they took without me weren't paid for with Richard's business income, as I'd always assumed, but with money from Charles's various investment accounts that they managed as trustees. I discovered today that Margaret has been forging my signature on withdrawal slips. One particularly damaging entry revealed. She's taken over $40,000 in the past 6 months alone, all while telling me she's managing my finances for my own good. The money has gone toward Bella's cotillion expenses and Richard's country club memberships. They see me as nothing more than a bank account with a heartbeat. But it was the entries about me that truly broke my heart and simultaneously filled me with a burning sense of purpose. Charles had been documenting not just my parents' cruelty, but my responses to it, tracking my resilience and intelligence with the precision of a scientist studying a fascinating specimen. Evelyn continues to excel despite their efforts to diminish her, he'd written when I was 16. Her analytical mind processes their emotional manipulations and adapts accordingly. She has learned to find validation internally rather than seeking it from people who are fundamentally incapable of providing it. This quality will serve her well when the time comes for her to take control of her own destiny. The later entries revealed Charles's growing conviction that intervention would eventually be necessary. He'd begun consulting with attorneys, financial advisors, and other professionals to construct what he called a fortress of protection around me, designed to activate only when my family's treatment became so egregious that legal action was justified. Today, I finalized the conditional clauses in my will. Read an entry dated just 6 months before his death. The primary inheritance will pass to Richard as expected, but the real assets, the house, the offshore accounts, the controlling interests and various investments will belong to Evelyn the moment her family attempts to disinherit her completely. I have also included provisions that will strip inheritance rights from anyone who actively opposes her claim to these assets. The brilliance of Charles's strategy began to crystallize as I read further. He hadn't just protected me financially, he'd created a test that would reveal my family's true character, while simultaneously providing me with the tools to hold them accountable for their choices. The will required what Charles termed a loyalty assessment, where I would have the authority to determine whether family members had acted in good faith or had forfeited their rights through betrayal. Evelyn will need to evaluate each family member's actions and determine who, if anyone, deserves to maintain their inheritance rights, the journal explained. This process will serve multiple purposes. It will force her family to confront the consequences of their behavior. It will empower her to make decisions based on justice rather than emotion. And it will ensure that the Grace family fortune supports those who truly embody the family's original values, rather than those who have corrupted them. As I continued reading, I began to understand that every conversation Charles and I had shared, every story he'd told me about business strategy and patience, every lesson about observing people's true motivations, had been carefully designed to prepare me for this moment. He'd been training me to see through manipulation, to recognize genuine remorse from calculated performance, to make difficult decisions based on principles rather than sentiment. The stories I tell Evelyn about justice and patience are not mere entertainment, he'd written. I am teaching her to think strategically, to understand that true power comes not from emotional reactions, but from careful planning and precise execution. She will need these skills when she inherits not just my money, but the responsibility to clean up the mess that Richard and Margaret have made of our family's legacy. The final entries revealed the depth of Charles's faith in my ability to handle what he knew would be an enormous burden. He'd watched me endure years of psychological abuse while maintaining my integrity, academic excellence, and essential humanity. In his eyes, I wasn't just the victim of my family's cruelty, I was the solution to it. Evelyn has been forged in the fire of injustice, and she has emerged stronger rather than bitter, wiser rather than broken, his last entry read. She understands the difference between revenge and justice, between punishment and correction. When the time comes for her to wield the power I'm leaving her, she will do so not out of hatred, but out of love for what our family could be if it were guided by someone who truly understands right from wrong. Closing the journal, I finally understood the true scope of what Charles had given me. This wasn't just money or property. This was the authority and responsibility to reshape my family according to principles of genuine justice. He'd spent years documenting their failures, building legal protections for my position, and most importantly, preparing me intellectually and emotionally for the moment when I would have to decide their fates. Every lesson about patience had been preparing me for this moment of power. Every story about justice had been equipping me with the moral framework I would need to make impossible decisions. Every conversation about strategy had been training me to think several moves ahead of people who saw me as nothing more than a pawn. Grandfather had turned me into a weapon, and I was ready to use it. 3 days passed before I decided to drive by the Grace family estate, my estate now, though the irony still felt surreal every time I thought about it. I'd spent those days in my apartment reading and rereading Charles's journal, consulting with Harrison Webb about the legal implications of my inheritance, and slowly beginning to understand the magnitude of the chess game my grandfather had orchestrated. What I wasn't prepared for was the scene I discovered when I pulled into the circular driveway of 247 Elm Street. The first sign that something had changed dramatically was the absence of my father's silver Mercedes and my mother's pristine white Lexus. In their place sat an older Honda Civic that I didn't recognize, its paint faded and one side mirror held on with electrical tape. The manicured lawn showed the first signs of neglect, with newspapers scattered across the front steps and what appeared to be past due notices stuffed into the mailbox. Before I could even park my car, the front door burst open and my family spilled out onto the porch like refugees fleeing a disaster. The sight of them stopped me cold. These were not the same people who had expelled me from the wedding reception with such calculated cruelty just 72 hours ago. Richard's usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit replaced with wrinkled khakis and a polo shirt that had seen better days. Margaret looked even worse, her makeup streaked and her designer dress swapped for what appeared to be the same clothes she'd worn yesterday. But it was Bella who shocked me most of all. My golden sister, who had floated through her wedding reception like a princess in a fairy tale, now stood on the porch in jeans and a stained t-shirt, her perfect hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. The transformation was so dramatic that for a moment I wondered if I'd driven to the wrong house. "Evelyn!" Richard called out, his voice cracking with desperation as he hurried down the front steps. "Thank God you're here. We need to talk. There's been some terrible mistake with the legal paperwork, some mix-up with your grandfather's will." I stepped out of my car, slowly, deliberately savoring the moment in ways I'd never imagined possible. For the first time in my adult life, I was watching my father approach me not with dismissal or irritation, but with genuine need. His usual commanding presence had evaporated, replaced by the frantic energy of a man whose world had just collapsed around him. "There's no mistake, Dad," I said calmly, using a tone I'd learned from Charles himself, measured, authoritative, completely in control. "The house belongs to me. It always has." Margaret stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her like a penitent seeking absolution. "Darling, surely we can work this out like a family. There must be some arrangement we can make. This house has been in the Grace family for generations. You can't possibly want to break up the family legacy over some legal technicality." The word "darling" coming from her lips after 3 days of silence since she'd handed me that suitcase felt like a slap. I studied her face, looking for some trace of the woman who had coldly banished me from my own sister's wedding, but found only desperation and the kind of panic that comes from realizing you've vastly miscalculated. "The arrangement was made 17 years ago by Grandfather Charles," I replied, watching their faces carefully for any sign that they understood the full scope of what they were dealing with. He was very specific about the conditions under which this arrangement would take effect. Richard's face had gone pale. "Evelyn, you have to understand our position. The wedding expenses were enormous, and we'd made certain financial commitments based on our expectation that the house would remain in the family as planned. Without access to the property as collateral, we're facing some very serious difficulties." I almost laughed at the euphemism, difficulties, as if they'd encountered a minor inconvenience rather than the complete collapse of their financial house of cards. Through my conversations with Harrison Webb, I'd learned the true extent of their crisis. The wedding alone had cost nearly $200,000, all of it financed through loans secured against what they'd believed was their guaranteed inheritance. Their Manhattan apartment, leased at an astronomical monthly rate to maintain their social standing, had become impossible to sustain without the steady income from Charles's trust funds that had been quietly redirected to me the moment they'd cast me out. "Where are you staying now?" I asked, noting the absence of their luxury vehicles and the general air of barely controlled panic that surrounded them. "We've been staying at the Hampton Inn." Bella spoke for the first time, her voice flat and bitter. "Our apartment lease was terminated when the rent checks bounced. Apparently, the trust funds that were supposed to cover our expenses have been frozen." The sight of Bella's face contorted with rage and humiliation filled me with a satisfaction I hadn't expected. This was the same woman who had smirked at me as I was handed that suitcase, who had stood by silently as our parents publicly severed me from the family. Now she was reduced to staying in a budget hotel, her fairy tale life crumbling as quickly as it had been built. "The funds aren't frozen," I corrected her. "They've been transferred to their rightful owner, me." Richard took another step closer, and I saw something I'd never witnessed before in my entire life: my father preparing to beg. His shoulders sagged. His hands trembled slightly, and when he spoke again, his voice carried none of its usual authority. "Evelyn, please. I know we've had our differences, and perhaps we didn't handle things at the wedding as well as we should have. But you're still our daughter, still part of this family. Surely you don't want to see us homeless, to see your own sister sleeping in some motel room." The word "differences" hung in the air like a toxic cloud. 32 years of systematic emotional abuse culminating in my public banishment from the family, reduced to mere differences. The casual minimization of decades of cruelty was so perfectly characteristic of my father that I almost smiled. "I'm not making you homeless," I said, letting the words sink in slowly. "I'm simply claiming what was always mine. but I suppose we could discuss some kind of arrangement." Hope flickered in Margaret's eyes like a candle in a hurricane. "An arrangement? You mean we could stay here in the family home?" I looked up at the house where I'd spent my childhood feeling like an unwelcome guest, where I'd been made invisible and insignificant for as long as I could remember. The same house where, according to Charles's journal, my parents had plotted my exclusion from family events and celebrations. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. "Perhaps," I said carefully, watching them hang on every word. "But any arrangement would need to be on my terms. This is my house now, and anyone who stays here does so as my guest, not as someone with any claim to ownership or authority." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see them processing the implications, understanding for the first time that the power dynamic that had defined our family for 3 decades had not just shifted, it had completely inverted. This time, I was the one holding the power. The look of relief that washed over their faces when I agreed to let them stay was almost pathetic in its intensity. Richard's shoulders sagged as if an enormous weight had been lifted from them, while Margaret actually pressed her hand to her heart in a gesture of theatrical gratitude. But before any of them could mistake my decision for weakness or sentimentality, I held up my hand to establish the ground rules for this new arrangement. "You can stay," I said, my voice carrying the same authoritative tone I'd learned from years of boardroom presentations. "But this is my house now and will operate according to my rules. First, the master suite is mine. You'll need to choose from the guest bedrooms upstairs. Second, Charles's study and all of his personal belongings are completely off limits. Third, the main living room and dining room are reserved for my use. You're welcome to use the kitchen, the family room, and the back terrace, but only when I'm not using them." I watched their faces carefully as I laid out each condition, noting how their expressions shifted from relief to confusion to barely suppressed indignation. They had expected to be welcomed back into their former domain as if nothing had changed, as if the house they'd considered theirs for decades would continue to function according to their established patterns and preferences. Furthermore, I continued enjoying the way they hung on every word. Any guest privileges can be revoked at any time for any reason without notice. This is not a negotiation or a partnership. This is charity, and charity comes with conditions. Bella's face flushed red with barely controlled anger. "You can't be serious. We're supposed to live like boarders in our own home." "This was never your home, Bella," I replied calmly. "It was always Charles's home, and now it's mine. You've been living here as dependents for your entire adult life, and now you'll continue to live here as dependents but under new management." Richard started to object, his businessman's instincts kicking in despite his desperate circumstances. "Now, Evelyn, surely we can discuss this arrangement more reasonably. We're family after all, and family doesn't treat each other like what?" I interrupted, my voice cutting through his protests like a blade. "Like they're unwelcome at their own sister's wedding. Like they're embarrassments who need to be removed from family gatherings. Like they're disappointments who don't deserve basic respect or consideration." The silence that followed was electric with tension. For the first time in my life, I had rendered my family speechless, and the power of that moment was intoxicating. They stood there on the front porch of what had once been their sanctuary, suddenly understanding that the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. Over the following days, I watched them navigate their new reality with a mixture of fascination and satisfaction. The psychological impact of the role reversal became apparent almost immediately. Richard, who had always moved through the house with the confidence of absolute ownership, now hesitated before entering rooms, checking to see if I was present before claiming any space for himself. I would find him hovering uncertainly in hallways, clutching his morning coffee like a shield while he waited to determine whether the kitchen was available for his use. Margaret's transformation was even more dramatic. The woman who had orchestrated elaborate dinner parties in the main dining room now asked permission before using the good china, her voice small and uncertain as she requested access to serving pieces she had selected and arranged herself years earlier. I would catch her staring longingly at the formal living room where she had entertained Connecticut's elite, her fingers tracing the doorframe but never crossing the threshold I had declared forbidden. But it was Bella whose adjustment proved most entertaining to observe. She moved through the house like a ghost of her former self. Her usual confident stride replaced by careful, measured steps that avoided drawing attention. Gone were the days when she would sprawl across the leather sofa in Charles's study, talking loudly on her phone while painting her nails. Now she confined herself to the smaller spaces I had allocated her presence, becoming as diminished as mine had once been. The most revealing moments came during mealtimes when the family gathered in the breakfast nook, rather than the formal dining room they had always preferred. I would watch them exchange glances loaded with unspoken frustration, their conversations stilted and cautious as they navigated topics that might offend their new landlord. They discussed the weather with exaggerated interest, avoided mentioning their financial troubles, and spoke about future plans in the vague, hopeful terms of people who no longer controlled their own destiny. Margaret made several attempts to bridge the gap between us with apologies that sounded rehearsed and strategic rather than genuine. "Evelyn, darling, I hope you know that we never intended to hurt you at the wedding. Perhaps we got caught up in the excitement of the moment and didn't express ourselves as clearly as we should have." Each time she tried to rewrite history with these careful non-apologies, I would simply smile and nod without responding, leaving her hanging in the uncomfortable silence that followed. My refusal to engage with her attempts at reconciliation created an atmosphere of perpetual uncertainty that kept all of them off balance and anxious. The strategic value of my silence became apparent as I watched them struggle to interpret my intentions. Without the usual patterns of family communication to guide them, they found themselves constantly guessing at my mood, my plans, my level of satisfaction with their behavior. Were they performing adequately as house guests? Had they crossed any invisible lines? How long would this arrangement continue, and what would it take to secure their position more permanently? I began to understand why Charles had spoken so often about the power of patience and observation. From my position of authority, I could see how desperate they were to return to some version of their former dynamic, how much they missed the comfortable certainty of their old roles. They wanted forgiveness, reconciliation, a return to family harmony that would restore their sense of security and belonging. They thought it was mercy, but it wasn't. Living with their uncertainty for 2 weeks had given me time to carefully plan my next moves, and I decided that Bella deserved the honor of being the first to understand that mercy was not part of my vocabulary. While my parents had settled into a routine of nervous deference, Bella continued to carry herself with traces of her old arrogance, as if she believed this situation was temporary, and she would eventually reclaim her position as the family's golden child. It was during one of our awkward family dinners in the breakfast nook that I made my first strike. Bella was complaining about the limitations of staying in a guest bedroom, making pointed comments about how cramped it felt compared to the master suite she'd always assumed would be hers someday. Her sense of entitlement, even in her diminished circumstances, provided the perfect opening for what I'd been planning. "Speaking of things that were never really yours," I said casually, reaching for my phone. I came across something interesting while going through some old emails. "Bella, do you remember when I lost that scholarship to Yale? The full ride that would have covered my tuition, room, and board?" I watched the color drain from her face as she realized where this conversation was heading. Richard and Margaret looked confused, but Bella's expression had shifted to something approaching panic. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said quickly, but her voice lacked conviction. "Really?" I smiled, scrolling through my phone with deliberate slowness. "Because I have copies of some very interesting correspondence here. Anonymous letters sent to the scholarship committee, filled with accusations about my character, my academic integrity, even my mental stability." The silence at the table was deafening. I could see Bella's hands trembling as she reached for her water glass, and Margaret had stopped eating entirely, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. "The strange thing about anonymous letters," I continued, "is that people often forget about digital footprints. Email headers, IP addresses, location data. It's remarkable what a good private investigator can uncover when they know where to look." Richard's voice was barely a whisper. Bella, you didn't." "She did." I confirmed, turning my phone so they could see the screen displaying copies of the emails Bella had sent, complete with technical evidence linking them back to her laptop. 3 separate letters to the scholarship committee, each one more damaging than the last. One questioned my psychological fitness for academic pressure. Another suggested I had cheated on standardized tests. The third claimed I had substance abuse problems. Bella's face had gone from pale to gray, and I could see tears forming in her eyes. But I wasn't finished yet. The scholarship committee took these accusations seriously enough to launch an investigation. By the time they determined the claims were false, the scholarship had already been awarded to another student. My academic future was derailed by lies, and I never knew who was responsible until now. "I was young," Bella whispered, her voice breaking. "I was scared you would overshadow me, that Mom and Dad would realize that you were mediocre," I finished for her. "That without the constant comparisons making you look better, people might notice you had no real accomplishments of your own." The confession hung in the air like poison gas, contaminating any remaining illusions about family loyalty or sisterly love. Margaret looked horrified while Richard stared at Bella as if seeing her clearly for the first time in decades. But that revelation was merely the appetizer for what I had planned next. 3 days later, I received an invitation to the Westbrook Foundation's annual charity gala, one of the most prestigious social events in Greenwich. The timing was perfect, especially since I knew Bella and her husband would be attending as part of their desperate attempt to maintain their social connections despite their financial troubles. The gala was held at the Greenwich Country Club, the same venue where many of Connecticut's elite gathered to see and be seen while writing checks for charitable causes they barely understood. I arrived fashionably late, wearing a designer dress that had cost more than most people's monthly salary, my confidence radiating in ways that made several heads turn as I moved through the crowd. I found Bella near the silent auction tables, desperately trying to maintain conversations with women who had once considered her a social peer. Her dress, while still elegant, was clearly from several seasons ago, and I could see the strain in her smile as she tried to project prosperity she no longer possessed. "Bella," I said warmly, approaching her with the kind of affection that immediately drew attention from nearby socialites. "I'm so glad you could make it tonight. We need to talk." I guided her to a quieter corner of the room, away from the main crowd, but still visible to anyone who might be watching. "I've been thinking about our conversation the other night about the scholarship situation. I want you to know that I forgive you." The relief that flooded her face was immediate and complete. "Evelyn, thank you. I can't tell you how much that means to me. I've felt terrible about it for years." "I'm sure you have," I said, my voice dripping with false sympathy. "It must be hard carrying that kind of guilt. I imagine there are other things you've done over the years that you regret." And there it was, the moment I'd been waiting for. Bella, so desperate for absolution and so relieved by what she thought was my forgiveness, began to confess. She told me about the times she'd deliberately sabotaged my relationships by spreading rumors to boys I liked. She admitted to hiding acceptance letters from colleges I'd applied to, ensuring I never knew about opportunities that might have taken me away from home. She even confessed to breaking several of my science fair projects over the years, claiming they were accidents when she knew perfectly well they weren't. What Bella didn't realize was that our entire conversation was being overheard by Helen Morrison, the veteran journalist who had been one of Charles's closest friends and who now wrote society columns for 3 different publications. Helen had positioned herself behind a large floral arrangement close enough to catch every word of Bella's confessions, while appearing to simply admire the auction items. "It feels so good to finally tell someone," Bella said, tears streaming down her face. "I've been carrying this guilt for so long, and knowing that you forgive me makes me feel like maybe I can start fresh." "Oh, Bella," I said softly, reaching out to touch her arm in what anyone watching would interpret as a gesture of sisterly compassion. "I think starting fresh is exactly what you need to do." 3 days later, Helen's column appeared in the Greenwich Gazette with the headline, "The Price of Sibling Rivalry, A Local Family's Dark Secrets." The article was a masterpiece of subtle journalism, never directly naming Bella, but providing enough detail that anyone familiar with our family would immediately recognize her as the subject. It described a pattern of deliberate sabotage and emotional cruelty that painted a picture of someone fundamentally lacking in character and integrity. The response was immediate and devastating. Within hours, Bella's husband received calls from business associates who had read the article. Her remaining social connections began to distance themselves, canceling lunch invitations and removing her from committee assignments. The carefully constructed image she'd spent years building crumbled in a single day. Bella thought she could escape, but I had prepared a much bigger blow. The fallout from Bella's public exposure had barely begun to settle when I turned my attention to Margaret, who had been watching her daughter's social destruction with growing alarm, while somehow believing she would escape similar scrutiny. My mother had always prided herself on being more sophisticated than Bella, more careful in her manipulations, but Charles's journal had provided me with ammunition that would prove her confidence was tragically misplaced. The financial records Charles had meticulously documented painted a clear picture of Margaret's systematic theft from family accounts over the course of nearly a decade. What made her crimes particularly damning was not just the money she had stolen, but the elaborate web of lies she had constructed to cover her tracks. She had positioned herself as Charles's devoted caretaker, the responsible daughter-in-law managing his affairs out of love and duty, all while systematically draining his accounts to fund her own vanity projects. I spent a week carefully preparing my case, working with Harrison Webb and the private investigator Charles had recommended to compile irrefutable evidence of Margaret's financial crimes. Bank statements, forged signatures, fraudulent wire transfers, credit card charges for luxury items, all traced back to accounts that were supposed to be held in trust for charitable purposes. The scope of her embezzlement was breathtaking in its audacity and devastating in its implications. The Greenwich Gazette proved to be an excellent vehicle for exposing Margaret's crimes, particularly since their financial reporter had been investigating irregularities in several local charitable organizations and was delighted to have such a concrete example of donor fraud to showcase. The article that appeared on Thursday morning was titled, "Trust Betrayed Local Socialite Accused of Embezzling Elderly Relatives' Charitable Funds," and it laid out Margaret's crimes in excruciating detail. The piece described how Margaret Grace had forged her father-in-law's signature on dozens of documents, transferring money earmarked for local children's charities into personal accounts that she used to pay for her daughter's private school tuition, country club memberships, and luxury vacations to Europe. The article noted that Charles Grace had been known for his philanthropic generosity, making his daughter-in-law's betrayal particularly shocking to those who had respected his charitable work. What made the article especially devastating was the inclusion of specific dollar amounts and dates, creating a timeline that showed Margaret's theft had accelerated dramatically during Charles's final years when his health was declining and he was less able to monitor his own finances. The newspaper had even obtained copies of thank you letters from charities that had never received the donations Margaret claimed to have sent, adding a layer of heartbreaking irony to her crimes. The response from Greenwich's high society was swift and merciless. By Friday afternoon, Margaret had been removed from the boards of 3 different charitable organizations. Her membership at the country club was under review, and several prominent families had canceled their attendance at events where she was expected to be present. The social isolation was complete and immediate, as if she had been diagnosed with a contagious disease that threatened to infect anyone who associated with her. The Greenwich Historical Society's autumn fundraiser held the following Saturday evening provided the perfect venue for Margaret's complete public humiliation. This was the same event where she had served as co-chair for the past 5 years, the kind of prestigious position that had defined her status in the community and validated her sense of importance among Connecticut's elite. I arrived at the event knowing that Margaret would be there despite the scandal, partly out of denial, and partly because she still held some faint hope that she could rehabilitate her reputation through a public appearance. I found her standing alone near the silent auction tables, her usual crowd of admirers and social allies having evaporated like morning mist. She wore an elegant black dress that I recognized as one she'd purchased years ago, before her financial crimes had been exposed, and her makeup was applied with the kind of desperate precision that suggested she'd spent hours trying to create a facade of normalcy. The moment she saw me approaching, her face crumpled with a mixture of fear and pleading that would have moved me to pity if I hadn't spent 32 years watching her treat me with calculated cruelty. "Evelyn, please," she whispered, glancing around nervously to see if anyone was watching our interaction. "We need to talk about this misunderstanding. There are things you don't understand about the family finances." "Misunderstanding?" I repeated, my voice carrying just enough to draw attention from nearby guests. "Mother, I understand perfectly. You stole money from Charles that was meant for children's charities. You forged his signature dozens of times. You used his declining health as an opportunity to rob him blind while pretending to care for his welfare." The guests nearest to us had stopped their conversations to listen, and I could see heads turning as word spread through the room that the Grace family drama was playing out in real time. Margaret's face flushed red with embarrassment and desperation as she realized she was becoming the evening's entertainment. "It wasn't like that," she protested, her voice rising in pitch as panic set in. "I was managing the accounts for his own good. He was getting confused about his finances, and I was protecting him from making mistakes. The money was always meant to stay in the family eventually." Her justifications only made things worse as several guests exchanged glances that clearly communicated their disgust with her excuses. I watched Eleanor Whitman, the president of the Historical Society, and one of Margaret's former closest friends, literally turn her back and walk away rather than continue listening to the pathetic attempts at rationalization. "You protected him?" I asked incredulously. "By stealing donations meant for sick children? By using his generosity to pay for Bella's cotillion dresses and European shopping trips?" The circle of listeners had grown larger now, and I could see smartphones being discreetly raised as people began recording what was clearly going to become the most talked-about social scandal of the season. Margaret seemed to shrink before my eyes, her usual commanding presence dissolving under the weight of public scrutiny and moral judgment. "Please," she begged, reaching out to grab my arm with trembling fingers. "I'll pay it all back. I'll make it right. Just tell people it was a misunderstanding. You have the power to fix this to save what's left of our family's reputation." I looked down at her hand on my arm, then up at her face where mascara had begun to streak despite her careful application. "The only misunderstanding here is your belief that actions don't have consequences, that family loyalty means covering up crimes, and that your reputation matters more than the children you robbed." The silence that followed was complete and damning. Margaret's breakdown was visible to everyone present, her carefully maintained facade finally cracking completely as she realized that her social death was not only inevitable but richly deserved. The woman who had spent decades judging others, excluding people from her social circle, and using charity work as a vehicle for her own aggrandizement was finally experiencing the isolation and contempt she had so freely dispensed to others. But I still had one final card to play against her. Margaret's public humiliation at the Historical Society fundraiser had sent shockwaves through Greenwich's social circles, but I knew that destroying her reputation was only part of the equation. Richard had been watching his wife's downfall with the calculating detachment of a businessman, assessing collateral damage, apparently believing that his own carefully constructed professional facade would protect him from similar scrutiny. He had no idea that Charles's journal contained detailed records of his financial crimes, or that I had already begun orchestrating his professional destruction with the same methodical precision he had once used to exclude me from family decisions. The key to unraveling Richard's business empire lay in his partnership with Marcus Whitfield, a relationship that had been built on mutual greed and sustained by increasingly desperate schemes to maintain their lavish lifestyles. Charles had documented several instances where Richard had used family property as collateral for business loans without proper authorization, forging documents and manipulating property records to secure financing for ventures that were doomed to fail from the start. I spent a week carefully crafting the information package I would send to Marcus, knowing that his reaction would be the catalyst for Richard's complete professional annihilation. The documents I compiled painted a devastating picture of Richard's financial desperation and illegal practices, including copies of forged mortgage applications, evidence of property liens filed without proper consent, and records showing how Richard had been systematically stealing from their shared business accounts to cover his personal debts. The beauty of my strategy lay in letting Richard's own partner deliver the killing blow. Marcus Whitfield was not a sentimental man, and his loyalty to Richard extended only as far as their mutual profitability. When faced with evidence that his business partner had been committing fraud that could implicate him in criminal activity, Marcus's response was predictably self-serving and immediate. The confrontation took place on a Tuesday morning at Richard's office, a sleek space in a Greenwich office building that he had maintained as a symbol of his professional success. I had positioned myself in the coffee shop across the street with a clear view of the building's entrance, waiting to witness the moment when Richard's world would begin its final collapse. Marcus arrived at exactly 9:30, his usual punctuality now serving a darker purpose than their typical business meetings. He carried a briefcase that I knew contained copies of all the evidence I had provided, along with legal documents that would sever their partnership and protect him from the fallout of Richard's crimes. The expression on his face as he entered the building was grim and determined, the look of a man prepared to sacrifice his partner to save himself. 20 minutes later, I could hear shouting from the third-floor windows, Richard's voice rising in anger and desperation as he realized the scope of the accusations being leveled against him. Marcus's responses were calmer, but no less damaging, his businessman's tone cutting through Richard's protests like a knife through silk. The meeting lasted less than an hour, but its effects were immediately visible when Marcus emerged from the building and spent the next 30 minutes on his phone, undoubtedly calling their investors and business associates to distance himself from Richard's fraudulent practices. I watched him pace the sidewalk, his gestures animated and urgent, as he engaged in damage control conversations that would seal Richard's professional fate. By noon, the first investor had arrived at the office building, followed within the hour by two more, all of them carrying briefcases and wearing the grim expressions of people who had just discovered they'd been defrauded. Richard's afternoon was consumed by a series of increasingly hostile meetings as his financial backers confronted him with evidence of his illegal activities and demanded immediate explanations for the discrepancies in their investments. The exodus began that same evening. James Morrison, who had invested over $2 million in Richard's latest development project, was the first to formally withdraw his support, sending a terse letter that not only demanded the return of his investment, but also threatened legal action if the money wasn't repaid within 30 days. Patricia Blackwood followed suit the next morning, her lawyer hand-delivering a cease-and-desist order that effectively froze all of Richard's business operations pending a full financial audit. Within 48 hours, Richard's professional network had completely collapsed. The development projects that had been the foundation of his business empire were suddenly without funding. His office lease was in jeopardy due to bounced checks, and his business phone had been disconnected for non-payment. The man who had once commanded respect in Greenwich's business community now found himself persona non grata in every professional circle he had once dominated. I encountered him on Thursday evening as he was leaving his office building for what I suspected would be the last time, carrying a cardboard box filled with personal items and looking like a man who had aged 10 years in 3 days. His usually perfect appearance had deteriorated noticeably. His tie was askew, his shirt wrinkled, and his hair showed signs of the nervous habit he'd developed of running his fingers through it when under extreme stress. "Evelyn," he said when he spotted me approaching, his voice carrying none of its former authority. "I suppose you've heard about the troubles at the office?" "Troubles," I repeated, savoring the euphemism. "Dad, I heard that your business partners have accused you of fraud, that your investors are demanding their money back, and that you're facing potential criminal charges for illegal property mortgages." His face went pale as he realized I knew the specific details of his predicament, details that suggested my involvement in his downfall went far beyond coincidental timing. "How do you know about the mortgages? Those records are supposed to be confidential." Nothing involving Charles's property was ever confidential from Charles, I replied, watching his expression shift from confusion to the dawning realization that his crimes had been documented and preserved for exactly this moment. He kept very detailed records of your financial manipulations, Dad. Every forged signature, every illegal lien, every fraudulent loan application. The cardboard box slipped from his hands, spilling family photos and business awards across the sidewalk in a symbolically perfect representation of his fallen status. Richard stared at the scattered remnants of his professional life, then looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before in 32 years of knowing him. And for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. The sight of Richard's fear had been more satisfying than I'd anticipated, but it also marked a turning point in my campaign that required careful legal maneuvering to ensure my family couldn't mount any effective counterattack. While I had Charles's journal and Harrison Webb's banking expertise on my side, I needed someone with specialized knowledge of estate law and family litigation to anticipate and block any desperate legal challenges my parents might attempt as their world continued to collapse around them. Daniel Brooks came into my life through Helen Morrison's recommendation, though she described him in terms that suggested he was far more than just another estate attorney. "He's brilliant," she'd told me over coffee at a quiet cafe in downtown Greenwich. "But more importantly, he understands what it means to fight for justice when the system has failed you. He's been where you are, Evelyn, and he survived it." My first meeting with Daniel was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon at his modest office in Stamford, a deliberately unpretentious space that stood in sharp contrast to the marble and mahogany luxury I'd expected from a lawyer with his reputation. The man who greeted me was younger than I'd anticipated, probably in his late 30s, with prematurely gray hair and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing about his own thoughts. "Miss Grace," he said, extending his hand with a firm grip that conveyed both confidence and warmth. "Helen told me about your situation. I've reviewed the preliminary documents Harrison Webb provided, and I have to say, your grandfather was remarkably thorough in protecting your interests." As we settled into his office, I found myself studying Daniel's face for signs of the judgment or pity I'd grown accustomed to receiving from other professionals who learned about my family's treatment of me. Instead, I saw something I hadn't expected recognition. Not the superficial acknowledgement of shared circumstances, but the deeper understanding that comes from having walked a similar path through darkness. "Before we discuss the legal specifics," Daniel said, settling behind his desk with a cup of coffee that looked like it had been brewing since morning, "I want you to know that I don't take cases like this lightly. Family litigation is ugly under the best circumstances, and when it involves systematic emotional abuse and financial manipulation, it becomes something else entirely." His directness was refreshing after weeks of careful conversations with bankers and investigators who approached my situation with professional detachment. Daniel spoke about emotional abuse as if he understood its mechanics intimately, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from personal experience rather than academic study. "Helen mentioned that you've dealt with family injustice yourself," I said, curious about the pain I could see flickering behind his professional composure. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming absently on the desk as he considered how much to reveal. "My parents died when I was 16, he finally said, his voice carefully controlled. "Car accident, very sudden. I had 2 older brothers who were supposed to take care of me, but they saw me as an inconvenience standing between them and their inheritance. They had me declared an emancipated minor and split our parents' estate between themselves, claiming I was too unstable to handle any financial responsibility." The parallels to my own experience were unmistakable, though his abandonment had come through legal manipulation rather than emotional cruelty. "What happened to you?" "I lived on my own, worked my way through college and law school, built a life, despite their efforts to erase me from the family narrative." His smile was bitter, but not defeated. "And 15 years later, when they came to me begging for help because they'd squandered everything our parents left them, I had the satisfaction of telling them exactly what they'd told me when I was 16 and desperate." There was something in his tone that told me his brother's comeuppance had been every bit as carefully orchestrated as my own campaign against my family. This wasn't a man who believed in letting bygones be bygones or turning the other cheek. This was someone who understood that justice sometimes required patient strategy and the willingness to see consequences through to their logical conclusion. The beauty of Charles's will, Daniel continued, pulling out a thick folder of legal documents, is that it's absolutely bulletproof against challenge. He worked with some of the best estate attorneys in the country to ensure that no court would ever overturn his decisions, regardless of what arguments your family might present. He walked me through the legal protections Charles had built into the inheritance structure, explaining how the offshore trusts were protected by international banking laws, how the property transfers had been executed with multiple layers of verification, and how the conditional clauses were written in language so precise that no judge would have grounds to question their validity. More than that, Daniel said his professional enthusiasm evident as he described the elegant complexity of Charles's legal strategy. The will includes specific penalties for anyone who attempts to challenge your inheritance rights. If your parents try to contest the will in court, they automatically forfeit any remaining claims to family assets, including the small trust funds Charles left them for basic living expenses. The implications were staggering. Not only were my parents powerless to reclaim the house or the major assets, but any attempt to fight me legally would result in their complete financial destruction. Charles had created a legal trap that would snap shut the moment they showed any sign of organized resistance to my authority. There's something else, Daniel added, his voice taking on a more personal tone as he leaned forward slightly. I want you to know that I admire what you're doing. Not everyone who's been treated the way you have finds the strength to demand accountability. Most people just try to move on, to forget to convince themselves that family harmony is more important than justice. His words hit me with unexpected force, partially because they validated feelings I'd been afraid to fully acknowledge, but mostly because they came from someone who clearly understood the difference between revenge and justice from his own hard-won experience. Charles didn't just leave you money and property. Daniel continued, his dark eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my breath catch slightly. He left you the power to reshape your family's future according to principles of actual fairness rather than the twisted dynamics that have defined your relationships up to now. As our meeting concluded and Daniel walked me to the door, I realized that I'd found something I hadn't been looking for: an ally who understood not just the legal mechanics of my situation, but the emotional and moral complexities of wielding power against people who had spent decades wielding it against me. Together, we would tighten the noose. Having Daniel's legal expertise protecting my flanks gave me the confidence to focus on the next phase of my campaign. But I hadn't anticipated that Bella would attempt such a brazenly desperate counterattack. The security system I'd installed throughout the house was primarily intended to monitor my family's compliance with the rules I'd established. But it proved invaluable in ways I hadn't expected when Bella decided to take matters into her own hands. The first indication that something was amiss came on a Wednesday morning when I reviewed the overnight footage from my home office. The cameras had captured Bella making several phone calls from the kitchen after midnight, her voice too low for the audio to pick up specific words, but her body language suggesting secretive, urgent conversations. She kept glancing toward the staircase where Richard and Margaret's bedroom was located, clearly trying to avoid detection by her parents. Over the next 2 days, I watched Bella's behavior become increasingly furtive. She would disappear for hours at a time, claiming to be job hunting or meeting with old friends, but her nervous energy when she returned suggested more complex activities. She had also begun paying unusual attention to the house itself, walking through rooms with the calculating gaze of someone conducting an evaluation rather than simply living in the space. The truth became clear the following Monday when my security cameras captured a scene that was both shocking in its audacity and pathetic in its desperation. At precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, while I was at my own office and Richard and Margaret were at their respective therapy appointments, Bella opened the front door to admit a middle-aged man in an expensive suit carrying a leather portfolio and a measuring tape. I watched in fascination as Bella led the man through the house with the confident demeanor of someone who owned the property, pointing out architectural details and discussing the various rooms as if she were conducting a legitimate showing. The man, who was clearly a real estate agent, took notes and photographs while Bella provided what appeared to be detailed information about the property's history and value. What made the scene particularly damning was Bella's performance as the property owner. She had obviously prepared for this meeting extensively, knowing specific details about square footage, property taxes, and recent comparable sales in the neighborhood. When the agent asked about paperwork, she produced a folder of documents from her purse, spreading them across the dining room table with the casual authority of someone accustomed to handling such transactions. The audio quality was excellent enough for me to hear most of their conversation, and what I learned was even more brazen than I'd expected. Bella was claiming to have power of attorney for the property, explaining to the agent that she was handling the sale on behalf of her grandfather's estate due to family complications that made it difficult for other relatives to be involved in the process. "The family has decided that a quick, quiet sale would be best for everyone involved," she told the agent, her voice carrying the same confident tone she'd used throughout her privileged life to get her way through charm and deception. "We're willing to price it competitively to ensure a fast transaction, and we can be flexible on closing dates." The agent, clearly impressed by both the property and what he perceived as Bella's reasonable approach to the sale, spent over an hour conducting a thorough evaluation. He photographed every room, measured the major spaces, and even spent time in the garden, discussing landscaping and outdoor entertaining possibilities. By the time he left, he was obviously excited about the listing and eager to begin marketing what would clearly be a substantial commission. That evening, I confronted Bella directly, though she had no idea I possessed video evidence of her fraud attempt. Bella had gone from being a disgraced social climber to being an actual criminal, someone whose face was now associated with fraud and theft in the minds of everyone who had ever known her. The video evidence made denial impossible, and the criminal referrals meant that her legal troubles were just beginning. She thought she was playing chess, but the board was mine. Bella's attempted real estate fraud had provided the perfect catalyst for what I knew would be the final phase of my family's public destruction, but I hadn't anticipated how eagerly the media would embrace the story, or how quickly it would spiral beyond my control into something much larger and more devastating than I'd originally planned. The video of Bella's fraudulent house showing had been shocking enough on its own, but it also served as the key that unlocked a treasure trove of related stories that journalists had been waiting years to tell. Helen Morrison proved to be an invaluable ally in orchestrating the media coverage, using her decades of connections in both local and regional journalism to ensure that the Grace family scandal received the attention it deserved. Within 48 hours of the security footage going viral, I was fielding calls from reporters at 3 different newspapers, 2 television stations, and a freelance journalist who specialized in high society scandals for a national magazine. The Hartford Courant was the first major publication to run a comprehensive investigation, publishing a front-page story titled "The Fall of the Grace Dynasty: How a Greenwich Family's Greed Led to Their Downfall." The article was a masterpiece of investigative journalism that wove together Bella's attempted fraud with Margaret's charitable embezzlement and Richard's illegal business practices, creating a narrative of systemic corruption that had finally caught up with people who believed themselves above consequences. But it was the Greenwich Times that delivered the most devastating blow with their weekend exposé titled "Privileged and Predatory Inside the Grace Family's Decades of Deception." The piece included detailed financial records, witness interviews, and a timeline that showed how the family's crimes had escalated over the years as their sense of entitlement grew more extreme. The article even featured quotes from Charles's former business associates who described their shock at learning how his own family had exploited his generosity and declining health. The television coverage proved even more damaging than the print articles, partly because the visual elements made the story more compelling for viewers who might not read lengthy newspaper investigations. Channel 8's Evening News ran a 5-part series called "Connecticut's Fallen Elite," featuring interviews with former employees, charity officials who had been defrauded, and business partners who had been victimized by Richard's schemes. The series included footage of the Grace family estate security camera clips of Bella's fraud attempt and archival video of Margaret at various charity events where she had accepted praise for donations she had actually stolen. Social media transformed the story from a local scandal into a regional phenomenon that seemed to tap into broader public frustration with wealthy people who believed rules didn't apply to them. The hashtag Grace Family Scandal began trending on multiple platforms as people shared their own encounters with the family's arrogance and cruelty over the years. The most damaging posts came from former employees who had worked for the Grace family in various capacities and felt safe to speak out now that their former employers had been publicly disgraced. Maria Santos, who had worked as a housekeeper for the family for over a decade, posted a detailed account of how Margaret had regularly accused her of stealing while simultaneously hiding her own theft of Charles's money. James Mitchell, a landscaper who had maintained their property, shared stories about Richard's habit of refusing to pay bills and then threatening lawsuits when contractors demanded compensation. But the posts that went most viral came from people who had been socially victimized by the family over the years. Former classmates of Bella's shared stories about her deliberate cruelty to less popular students, complete with yearbook photos and specific examples of bullying behavior that had been overlooked because of her family's status. Parents from various school districts posted about Margaret's habit of lobbying to exclude children from lower-income families from school events and activities. One particularly damaging post came from Jennifer Walsh, whose daughter had been Bella's classmate for 6 years before being systematically ostracized by a campaign that Jennifer now realized had been orchestrated by Margaret. "The Grace women destroyed my daughter's social life because they thought we weren't wealthy enough to associate with them," Jennifer wrote. "My daughter spent her entire high school years believing she was somehow inferior, and now I know it was because these people were sociopaths who enjoyed making other families suffer." The response to Jennifer's post was immediate and overwhelming, with dozens of other parents sharing similar stories about the Grace family's pattern of social cruelty and exclusion. The collective picture that emerged was of a family that had spent decades using their wealth and status as weapons against people who couldn't fight back, creating a trail of emotional damage that stretched back generations. The social isolation that followed was swift and absolute. Within a week of the media coverage reaching its peak, Richard, Margaret, and Bella found themselves completely cut off from the social networks that had defined their identities for decades. The country club, where they had been members for over 20 years, quietly revoked their membership, citing conduct incompatible with club values. The Historical Society removed Margaret from their board without discussion or ceremony. Even their own neighbors began crossing the street to avoid conversations treating the Grace family like carriers of a social disease that might be contagious. I watched this isolation unfold from my position of newfound power and influence, amazed at how quickly people who had once competed for my family's attention now treated them like pariahs. The same social circles that had celebrated Bella's wedding just months earlier now spoke about the Grace family in hushed, scandalized tones, their names becoming synonymous with the kind of entitled corruption that decent people found morally repugnant. The most satisfying moment came when I received a handwritten apology letter from the Greenwich Country Club's membership committee acknowledging that they had failed to properly investigate concerning behavior, and inviting me to apply for membership despite my family's disgrace. The letter was a perfect example of how quickly social power could shift when the truth finally emerged, transforming me from a dismissed outcast into someone whose approval was actively sought by the same institutions that had ignored me for decades. And that was just the beginning of the storm. The media storm had reached such intensity that I almost didn't notice Richard's approach until he was standing directly in front of me in the kitchen one evening, his usual commanding presence replaced by something I'd never seen before: genuine vulnerability. The past weeks had aged him visibly, carving new lines around his eyes and turning his hair completely gray at the temples. But it was the look in his eyes that stopped me cold, a mixture of desperation and what appeared to be authentic remorse. "Evelyn," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of its usual authority. "We need to talk, please." I continued preparing my dinner, not trusting myself to look directly at him while he was displaying this unfamiliar version of paternal emotion. "I think we've said everything we need to say to each other, Dad." "No, we haven't." He insisted, moving closer but maintaining a respectful distance that acknowledged the power shift between us. "There are things you don't know, things I should have told you years ago, that might help you understand why I acted the way I did." Despite my determination to remain unmoved by whatever manipulation he might attempt, something in his tone made me pause. This didn't sound like the calculated businessman's approach I'd expected, nor the entitled demand for forgiveness I'd prepared myself to reject. This sounded like a man who was genuinely struggling with guilt. "When you were 12, Richard began, his voice growing stronger as he found his footing in the story he needed to tell. "Your friend Sarah Coleman was in that terrible car accident. Do you remember how scared you were, how you cried for days thinking she might not survive?" The memory hit me with unexpected force. Sarah had been my closest friend during those difficult middle school years, one of the few people who had treated me with genuine kindness rather than the careful politeness most children showed toward the Grace family. When she'd been critically injured in a collision with a drunk driver, I'd been devastated, begging my parents to take me to the hospital every day and praying with the desperate fervor only children could manage. "The Coleman family didn't have insurance." Richard continued, watching my face carefully for signs that his words were having the intended effect. "The hospital bills were going to bankrupt them, and Sarah wasn't going to get the surgery she needed to walk again. You begged me to help, remember? You offered to give up your allowance, to sell your books, anything to save your friend." I did remember, though the memory was clouded by the pain of that terrible time. I had pleaded with my parents to help Sarah's family, offering every sacrifice a 12-year-old could imagine, desperate to save the person who had shown me what real friendship looked like. "I paid those bills, Evelyn," Richard said, his voice breaking slightly. "Every single one of them. The surgery, the rehabilitation, the follow-up care. It cost me over $200,000, and I never told anyone, not even Margaret. I did it because my daughter was heartbroken, and I couldn't stand to see you in that kind of pain." The revelation staggered me. Throughout all the years of feeling unloved and unwanted, I had never known about this act of generosity, this moment when my father had apparently put my emotional well-being above his own financial interests. Sarah had recovered completely, gone on to graduate from high school, with me even earned a college scholarship based partly on her inspirational story of overcoming adversity. I had always believed her recovery was simply the result of excellent medical care, never knowing that my father had made it possible. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. "Because that's not why I did it," Richard replied, tears forming in his eyes for the first time in my memory. "I didn't do it for credit or gratitude. I did it because you were my daughter, and your pain was killing me, and I would have done anything to make it stop." For a moment, I felt something shift inside me, a crack in the armor of righteous anger I'd been wearing for months. This was the father I had always hoped existed somewhere beneath the cold businessman who had dismissed my achievements and ignored my needs. This was evidence that he had loved me, at least in that one crucial moment, enough to make a significant sacrifice without expecting anything in return. But even as I felt myself softening toward this unexpected revelation, something nagged at me about the timing and circumstances of Richard's story. The strategic way he had chosen to reveal this information, the precise moment when my resolve might be weakening, the calculated appeal to a memory that would be particularly meaningful to me, it all felt too convenient, too perfectly designed to achieve maximum emotional impact. The next morning, I called Daniel and asked him to investigate Richard's claim about Sarah's medical bills. If this story was true, if my father had indeed made this sacrifice out of love for me, then perhaps I needed to reconsider the scope and intensity of my campaign against him. Daniel's response came within 24 hours, delivered in his characteristically direct manner during a phone call that shattered whatever softness I might have been developing toward my father. "The payments were real," he said, "but they weren't made by Richard. Charles paid those bills just like he paid for dozens of other charitable interventions over the years. The money came directly from your grandfather's personal accounts, and there are records showing that Charles specifically instructed Richard never to tell you about the source of the payments. The manipulation was so perfectly crafted that I had to admire its sophistication, even as I felt sick about nearly falling for it. Richard had taken credit for his own father's generosity, using a genuine act of love and sacrifice as emotional leverage to escape the consequences of his own cruelty. But what disturbed me most was how desperately I had wanted to believe him. For those few hours between his revelation and Daniel's investigation, I had felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood: the possibility that my father actually loved me. The hope that beneath all the years of neglect and dismissal, there had been a parent who cared enough to make real sacrifices for my happiness. That evening, when Richard approached me again, clearly expecting to build on what he assumed had been a successful emotional gambit, I looked at him with a clarity that cut through decades of wishful thinking and self-deception. "Charles paid Sarah's medical bills," I said simply, watching his face crumble as he realized his lie had been exposed. "You took credit for your own father's generosity to manipulate me into forgiving you for 32 years of emotional abuse." "Evelyn, please," he started, but I held up my hand to stop him. "No," I said firmly. "Justice isn't about forgiveness or family harmony or pretending that love existed where there was only cruelty. Justice is about consequences, about truth, about ensuring that actions have meanings that extend beyond the comfort of the people who commit them." As I walked away from him that night, leaving him standing alone in the kitchen where he had tried to buy his redemption with borrowed compassion, I understood that I had passed some kind of test. Not the test he had intended to give me, but the test that mattered: the ability to choose truth over the comfort of illusion, justice over the false peace of forgiveness. I had won. But why did I feel like I was losing a part of myself? Richard's failed manipulation had clarified my resolve in ways I hadn't expected, and I found myself approaching the final phase of Margaret's destruction with a cold precision that surprised even me. The question of whether I was losing parts of myself to this campaign of justice would have to wait. There was still work to be done, and Margaret's public humiliation required careful orchestration to achieve maximum impact. The opportunity presented itself through the Fairfield County Children's Hospital Foundation's annual Winter Gala, an event where Margaret had served as a committee member for over a decade, and which represented the pinnacle of her social calendar. Helen Morrison's connections proved invaluable once again, as she was able to ensure that Margaret received a personal invitation, despite the scandal swirling around her name. The invitation itself was a masterpiece of social warfare, worded in a way that made it impossible for Margaret to decline without appearing to admit guilt. "We would be honored by your presence at this year's gala," the invitation read, "especially given your long history of supporting children's charitable causes." The subtle emphasis on her charitable history was perfectly calculated to draw Margaret into what she couldn't possibly recognize as a trap. Margaret's decision to attend was driven by the same desperate need for social rehabilitation that had motivated all her previous actions. She spent days preparing for the event, purchasing a new dress despite their financial constraints, and practicing conversations that might help her repair her damaged reputation. I watched her preparations with fascination, marveling at how someone could be so completely blind to the reality of their situation. The gala was held at the Stamford Marriott, in a ballroom that glittered with crystal chandeliers and was filled with Connecticut's most philanthropically minded elite. I arrived early, positioning myself strategically where I could observe Margaret's entrance and the reactions of the other guests when they realized she had actually appeared at a public event. Margaret's entrance was everything I could have hoped for in terms of dramatic impact. She walked into the ballroom wearing a fixed smile that couldn't quite mask her underlying terror, her eyes scanning the crowd for friendly faces that were notably absent. The conversations around her didn't stop exactly, but they shifted in tone and volume as people noticed her presence and began whispering to their companions about the audacity of her appearance. The real devastation began during the cocktail hour, when Margaret attempted to rejoin conversations with women who had been her friends and collaborators for years. I watched from across the room as she approached Patricia Blackwood, who had co-chaired several events with Margaret over the past decade. Patricia's response was immediate and brutal. She literally turned her back on Margaret mid-sentence and walked away, leaving her standing alone with her champagne glass raised in a toast that would never be returned. The pattern repeated itself throughout the evening, as Margaret moved desperately through the crowd, trying to reclaim connections that had been severed by her crimes. Elizabeth Hartwell, who had been Margaret's closest friend on the hospital board, avoided eye contact entirely when Margaret approached her table. Susan Morrison, who had attended Margaret's dinner parties for over 15 years, actually stood up and moved to a different table rather than acknowledge her presence. But it was during the formal program that Margaret's humiliation reached its crescendo. The Foundation's president, Dr. Caroline Masters, was delivering remarks about the importance of trust and integrity in charitable work when she made what appeared to be an unscripted addition to her prepared speech. "Unfortunately, Doctor," Masters said, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sound system, "recent events have reminded us that not everyone who claims to support children's causes actually has children's best interests at heart. When adults steal money that was intended to help sick children, they don't just commit financial crimes, they betray the trust of every parent who has ever prayed for their child's recovery in these hospital corridors." The silence that followed was electric, and every eye in the room turned toward Margaret, who had gone completely pale and was gripping her table's edge so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Dr. Masters continued her remarks without looking directly at Margaret, but everyone present understood exactly who she was referencing. "The Foundation has a zero-tolerance policy for anyone who would exploit children's suffering for personal gain," Dr. Masters concluded. "We believe that such individuals have no place in any organization dedicated to children's welfare, and we will continue to work with law enforcement to ensure that justice is served." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Margaret remained frozen in her seat, apparently unable to process the reality that she had been publicly denounced at an event she had helped organize for over a decade. When the formal program ended and people began moving around the ballroom again, the isolation around Margaret became complete. Not a single person approached her table, offered her conversation, or even acknowledged her existence. I chose that moment to approach her, walking slowly across the ballroom floor as conversations stopped and people turned to watch what would clearly be the evening's most dramatic confrontation. Margaret looked up at me with eyes that were already red with unshed tears, her carefully applied makeup beginning to smudge despite her efforts to maintain composure. "Hello, Mother," I said, settling into the empty chair beside her with casual confidence. "I'm surprised to see you here. I would have thought you'd want to avoid events focused on children's charities given recent circumstances." "Evelyn, please," she whispered, her voice breaking with desperation. "I know I made mistakes, but this has gone too far. People are treating me like a criminal, like I never did anything good for anyone. I gave decades of my life to these organizations." "You gave decades of other people's money to these organizations," I corrected, my voice loud enough to carry to the nearby tables where people were straining to hear our conversation. "Charles's money specifically. Money that was supposed to help children, not fund your shopping trips and social climbing." Margaret's breakdown was complete and visible to everyone in the ballroom. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her makeup and destroying the composed facade she had worked so hard to maintain. "I'll pay it all back," she sobbed. "I'll make it right. Just please help me fix this. You have the power to make people forgive me." I looked at her with the same cold assessment I might give to a stranger begging for money on the street. "The only power I have is the power to tell the truth. And the truth is that you spent 32 years treating me like an inconvenience while stealing from sick children to fund your fake charitable persona." Margaret reached across the table, grasping my hand with fingers that trembled with desperation. "I'm your mother," she pleaded. "Doesn't that mean anything to you? Don't you have any love left for me at all?" I smiled then, the same cold smile I'd been perfecting throughout this campaign, and gently removed my hand from her grasp. "You taught me that family is about more than biology, Mother. You taught me that love has to be earned, that respect comes from actions rather than titles. You taught me those lessons every day for 32 years. The silence that followed was complete, broken only by Margaret's quiet sobbing and the whispered conversations of guests who were witnessing the final act of a family drama that had captivated their community for months. I stood up slowly, smoothing my dress and adjusting my jewelry with the casual confidence of someone who knew she held all the power in the room. But I wasn't ready to stop yet. Margaret's complete breakdown at the charity gala had marked a turning point that even I hadn't fully anticipated, but it was Bella's response to witnessing her mother's public destruction that revealed the true depth of her desperation. While Margaret retreated into shame and isolation, Bella doubled down on her belief that she could somehow salvage the situation through the same kind of social maneuvering that had always worked for her in the past. The first sign of Bella's final gambit came through Helen Morrison, who informed me that Bella had been making discreet inquiries about potential investors who might be willing to challenge my ownership of the Grace estate. Helen's sources in the financial community had reported that Bella was presenting herself as the rightful heir who had been temporarily displaced by legal technicalities, seeking someone powerful enough to mount a serious challenge to Charles's will. The investor she ultimately approached was Harrison Blackstone, a real estate mogul whose portfolio included several historic Connecticut properties and who had a reputation for aggressive acquisition tactics. Blackstone was exactly the kind of man Bella had always been drawn to, wealthy, powerful, and accustomed to getting his way through sheer financial force. In her mind, he represented salvation, someone who could restore her to her rightful position through the same kind of transactional relationship she'd built her entire identity around. I learned the details of their meeting through Daniel's investigative network, which had been monitoring potential threats to my legal position since the media coverage began. Bella had arranged to meet Blackstone at his Manhattan office, presenting herself in what remained of her designer wardrobe and armed with a carefully prepared presentation about the Grace family's assets and social connections. According to Daniel's sources, Bella's pitch was both pathetic and revealing. She offered Blackstone a partnership deal where he would provide the legal and financial resources to challenge Charles's will in exchange for a significant percentage of the estate's value once she regained control. She painted me as an unstable opportunist who had manipulated a senile old man while positioning herself as the legitimate heir who had been temporarily displaced by a legal conspiracy. But Bella had fundamentally misunderstood how the business world operates when scandal and legal liability are involved. Blackstone's response was swift and decisive. He wanted nothing to do with a family whose name had become synonymous with fraud, embezzlement, and criminal behavior. The Grace brand, which Bella still believed held value in elite circles, was now toxic to anyone concerned about their own reputation. "Miss Grace," Blackstone had reportedly told her, "even if your legal claims had merit, which my attorneys doubt associating with your family would be business suicide, your sister has documented evidence of criminal behavior spanning decades, and you yourself are facing potential fraud charges. I don't invest in lost causes, especially ones that come with criminal liability." The rejection was more than financial. It was a complete dismissal of everything Bella had believed about her own value and importance. For someone who had spent her entire life trading on family name and social connections, being told that those assets were now worthless represented a kind of existential destruction. When Bella returned from New York that evening, I could see the defeat in her posture before she even entered the house. She moved with the careful steps of someone who had finally understood that there would be no rescue, no dramatic reversal of fortune, no restoration of her former status. The golden daughter had been reduced to just another desperate person with no resources and no allies. Over the following days, I watched Bella cycle through the final stages of her denial. She made a few more phone calls to former social connections, but the conversations were brief and clearly unsuccessful. She spent hours on her laptop apparently researching legal options, but her increasingly frantic internet searches suggested she was finding nothing that could help her situation. The isolation was complete in ways that went beyond social ostracism. Margaret was too consumed by her own shame to provide emotional support. Richard was facing his own potential criminal charges and had no energy left for his daughter's problems. Bella found herself truly alone for perhaps the first time in her privileged life without the network of enablers and admirers who had always cushioned her from consequences. That evening, as the house settled into the quiet rhythm that had become our new normal, I found myself drawn to Charles's study for what I somehow knew would be the last time I'd need to seek his guidance. The room remained exactly as he'd left it, his books arranged on the shelves, his fountain pen still lying beside his reading chair, his presence somehow lingering in the careful organization he'd maintained throughout his life. I opened his journal to the final entries, the ones I'd read dozens of times but which seemed to carry new weight now that his predictions had come to pass so completely. Evelyn will face a choice. One entry read, between becoming the monster that hurt her and becoming the architect of justice. I believe she has the strength to choose correctly, but the decision will test everything I've tried to teach her about the difference between revenge and righteousness. Sitting in his chair, surrounded by the wisdom he'd accumulated over 8 decades of life, I felt the full weight of what we had accomplished together. The family that had dismissed me as worthless now depended entirely on my mercy for their survival. The people who had made me feel invisible now lived in terror of my attention. The system that had protected their cruelty had been turned against them with mathematical precision. But Charles's final lesson was becoming clear as I sat in his study, feeling his presence and wisdom surrounding me. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about transformation. It wasn't enough to destroy the people who had hurt me. I needed to ensure that the destruction served a larger purpose, that the suffering I had inflicted would ultimately create something better than what had existed before. The wooden box sat on his desk where I had placed it months ago when this campaign began. Its carved inscription still carrying the same message about patience and power. But now I understood that patience wasn't just about waiting for the right moment to strike. It was about waiting for the right moment to choose mercy, to demonstrate that true power lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to know when destruction had served its purpose. Now I was ready to end everything. The peace I had found in Charles's study was interrupted the following morning by an unexpected visitor, whose arrival would force me to confront the final moral complexity of my campaign. Helen Morrison stood at my front door with the kind of purposeful expression that suggested she carried information too important for a simple phone call, and her timing felt too significant to be coincidental. "Evelyn," she said as I invited her into the living room, "we need to discuss the endgame of what Charles set in motion 17 years ago. There are things about your grandfather's planning that even you don't know yet." Helen settled into the wingback chair that had always been Charles's favorite, and I was struck by how naturally she occupied the space, as if she had sat in that same spot many times before. Her familiarity with the house suddenly seemed less like journalistic research and more like intimate knowledge built over decades of friendship. "I helped Charles design more than just the media strategy for exposing your family." Helen continued, opening a leather portfolio that contained documents I'd never seen before. "I was part of the legal team that structured his will, the financial advisors who set up the offshore accounts, and the network of professionals who have been monitoring your situation for nearly 2 decades. The revelation stunned me. I had assumed that Helen's assistance was simply the result of professional friendship with Charles and her natural instincts as an investigative journalist. Learning that she had been actively involved in orchestrating my protection and eventual empowerment reframed every interaction we'd had since the campaign began. Charles knew that emotional abuse was harder to document than financial crimes, Helen explained, spreading photographs and documents across the coffee table between us. "So we spent years building a comprehensive record of your family's pattern of psychological manipulation and social cruelty. Every time they excluded you from family events, every instance of public humiliation, every moment when they made you feel worthless, we documented it all." The evidence she showed me was overwhelming in its scope and devastating in its implications. There were photographs of family gatherings where I had been deliberately excluded, taken by investigators Charles had hired to monitor my treatment. There were recorded phone conversations between Margaret and her friends, where she spoke about me with casual cruelty, discussing her disappointment in having such an unremarkable daughter. There were financial records showing how they had systematically diverted resources away from my education and opportunities while lavishing everything on Bella. "But this is where it gets complicated," Helen said, her expression growing more serious as she reached the final section of documents. "Charles also had us investigate and document crimes that go far beyond what you've already exposed. Margaret's embezzlement was just the beginning. There's evidence of tax fraud, insurance fraud, and systematic theft from multiple charitable organizations spanning over 15 years. The documents she showed me painted a picture of criminal behavior so extensive that I struggled to process its scope. My parents hadn't just stolen from Charles and a few children's charities, they had been running sophisticated fraud schemes that had victimized dozens of organizations and individuals over the course of decades. The evidence was ironclad, complete with bank records, forged documents, and witness statements that would guarantee criminal convictions and decades in prison. Richard's business crimes go even deeper. Helen continued, showing me files that documented illegal real estate schemes, investor fraud, and money laundering operations that connected my father to criminal networks I'd never imagined him capable of accessing. We have evidence that could result in federal charges, asset forfeiture, and prison sentences that would effectively end their lives as free people. I stared at the documents spread before me, understanding for the first time the true extent of my family's corruption and the complete nature of Charles's preparation for this moment. He had given me the power not just to humiliate and financially destroy my parents, but to obliterate them so completely that they would never recover from the consequences of their actions. "Charles wanted you to have all the weapons," Helen said quietly, watching my face as I absorbed the implications of what she had shown me. "But he also wanted you to choose how to use them. He believed that true justice required wisdom, not just power." The moral weight of the decision was staggering. I could release this evidence and watch my parents face criminal prosecution that would destroy them, utterly ensuring they spent their remaining years in federal prison while their assets were seized to compensate their victims. The justice would be complete and absolute, the consequences perfectly proportioned to decades of cruelty and criminal behavior. But I also understood that releasing this information would inevitably implicate Charles himself, since many of the fraudulent schemes had been conducted using his financial resources and business connections. His reputation as a respected businessman and philanthropist would be tarnished by association with their crimes, and the charitable organizations he had genuinely supported would suffer from the scandal. "Why are you showing me this now?" I asked Helen, still struggling to process the scope of the evidence before me. "Because Charles's final instruction was that you should only see this information if you had successfully demonstrated the difference between justice and revenge," she replied. "He wanted to know that you could resist the temptation to use maximum force simply because it was available. The fact that you've brought your family to this point through strategic exposure rather than nuclear destruction convinced me that you're ready to make this choice responsibly." I walked to the window overlooking the garden where Charles and I had spent so many afternoons discussing justice and patience, trying to imagine what he would counsel me to do with this ultimate weapon. The man who had taught me about the power of restraint and the importance of proportional response had also provided me with the means to achieve total victory over people who had shown me no mercy throughout my entire life. The documents represented more than just evidence, they represented a test of everything Charles had tried to teach me about the difference between justice and vengeance. I could destroy my family so completely that they would never again pose any threat to me or to anyone else, ensuring that their capacity for harm was permanently eliminated. I could destroy them completely, but should I? The weight of Helen's revelations had given me a sleepless night to contemplate the full scope of my power. But by morning, I had made my decision about how to proceed, and the sight that greeted me in the kitchen confirmed that the moment for final judgment had arrived. My family sat around the breakfast table in various states of defeat, each of them bearing the visible marks of their individual collapses. And I realized that the breaking point I had been orchestrating for months was finally complete. Bella's transformation was the most dramatic of the three. The woman who had once floated through social gatherings like a princess now sat hunched over a cup of coffee that had grown cold while she stared at her phone screen with desperate intensity. Her wedding ring, the symbol of her fairy tale marriage and social triumph, was notably absent from her finger, leaving a pale band of skin that told its own story of recent loss. "James called off the engagement," she said without looking up when she noticed me watching her. "His family's lawyers advised him that staying married to me would expose him to potential criminal liability. Apparently, being associated with fraud and embezzlement isn't compatible with his trust fund." Her voice carried none of its former entitlement, replaced instead by the flat affect of someone who had finally run out of options. The phone calls from potential employers had stopped coming after the media coverage reached its peak. The social connections that might have helped her find work had all distanced themselves from the Grace family name. Even the basic dignity of maintaining appearances had become impossible when every public appearance resulted in whispers, stares, and the kind of social scrutiny that made normal life unbearable. Richard's collapse had been more gradual but equally thorough. The business partnerships that had defined his professional identity were gone, dissolved through legal actions that had left him not just unemployed, but unemployable. His former colleagues crossed the street to avoid conversations, and the country clubs where he had once wielded influence had quietly suggested he not renew his memberships. "The criminal investigation is expanding," he told me, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who had aged a decade in the span of months. "They're looking at tax evasion charges now, potentially racketeering. My attorney says I could be facing federal prison time." The proud businessman who had once dismissed me as a disappointment now spoke with the defeated tone of someone who understood that his own life was effectively over. But it was Margaret's destruction that felt most complete, perhaps because her identity had been so thoroughly tied to social status and community recognition. The woman who had spent decades crafting her image as a charitable pillar of the community now rarely left the house, unable to face the contemptuous stares and whispered condemnations that followed her everywhere. "They removed my name from the memorial garden," she said quietly, referring to a children's hospital project she had co-chaired years earlier. 20 years of volunteer work, and they're erasing every trace of my involvement. It's as if I never existed. The irony was perfect. The woman who had made me feel invisible was finally experiencing that same erasure herself. The three of them sat in that kitchen like the survivors of a catastrophe, which in many ways they were. The catastrophe of their own making, the inevitable consequence of decades of cruelty and criminal behavior, had finally caught up with them in ways that left no possibility of recovery or redemption. I poured myself coffee and joined them at the table, studying their faces with the same analytical detachment I might bring to a business presentation. These were the people who had shaped my entire childhood through systematic emotional abuse, who had convinced me I was worthless, while stealing from charities and defrauding investors. The power dynamic that had defined our family for over 3 decades had not just shifted, it had completely inverted. "I think it's time we discussed your future," I said, my voice carrying the calm authority that had replaced the desperate pleading of my childhood. "All of you are facing criminal charges that will likely result in prison sentences. Your assets have been frozen or seized. Your social networks have completely rejected you. You have no income, no prospects, and no friends." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of their collective defeat. They looked at me with expressions that combined fear, shame, and a kind of desperate hope that perhaps I might offer them some path toward salvation. "You are sitting in my house eating food I purchased, depending entirely on my charity for your basic survival." I continued, letting the reality of their complete dependence sink in. The family that once treated me like an unwelcome burden is now surviving solely because of my generosity. Richard started to speak, perhaps to offer some final plea for mercy or forgiveness, but I held up my hand to stop him. This was not a moment for negotiation or discussion. This was the moment Charles had been preparing me for throughout my entire life, the culmination of a campaign that had taken months to execute and decades to earn. "For 32 years you made me feel invisible, worthless, and unwanted in my own family. I said, my voice remaining steady, despite the emotional weight of what I was saying. You stole my childhood, sabotaged my opportunities, and finally cast me out in front of 200 witnesses because you thought I had no power to resist. I stood up slowly, enjoying the way they all looked up at me with the kind of fearful attention I had craved throughout my childhood. The psychological roles had been completely reversed. They were now the powerless ones seeking approval and mercy from someone they had systematically abused. But you made one critical error in your calculations. I continued walking to the window that overlooked the garden where Charles had taught me about patience and justice. You underestimated both Charles's love for me and his understanding of exactly who you really were. Bella was crying now, quiet tears that streaked her makeup and transformed her from the golden daughter into just another broken person facing consequences she had never imagined possible. Margaret stared at her hands, unable to meet my eyes, while Richard seemed to shrink in his chair with each word I spoke. Charles gave me more than money and property, I said, turning back to face them. He gave me the power to decide your fates, to determine whether you deserve mercy or justice, to choose what kind of consequences you'll face for a lifetime of cruelty. The moment had arrived that Charles had been preparing me for since I was 15 years old, the test that would determine whether I had learned the difference between revenge and justice, between punishment and correction. 3 broken people sat before me completely at my mercy, their futures entirely dependent on my decision, and that's when I chose their punishment. The silence that filled the kitchen after my declaration stretched for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the sound of Bella's quiet sobbing and the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock that had marked time in this house for 3 generations. I watched their faces process the reality of their situation, seeing the exact moment when each of them understood that their comfortable assumptions about family loyalty and unconditional forgiveness were about to be shattered forever. Richard was the first to break his composure, cracking like ice under pressure, as he pushed back from the table and fell to his knees beside my chair. The sight of my father, who had spent my entire childhood projecting authority and dominance, now groveling on the kitchen floor, was so surreal that I almost couldn't process it as reality. "Evelyn, please," he sobbed, his voice breaking with emotion I had never heard from him before. "I know I failed you. I know I was a terrible father who chose favorites and broke your heart 1,000 times over. I spent 32 years being blind to what Bella was doing to you, blind to how Margaret was treating you, blind to my own cruelty." Tears streamed down his face as he reached toward me with shaking hands, not quite daring to touch but desperate for any sign of connection. I convinced myself that loving Bella more was somehow natural, that she needed more attention because she was more fragile. But the truth is that I was a coward who took the easy path, who gave love to the child who demanded it loudest, instead of the one who deserved it most. His confession was everything I had dreamed of hearing throughout my childhood, the acknowledgement of favoritism and injustice that had shaped every day of my young life. But hearing it now, when he was motivated by desperation rather than genuine remorse, felt hollow rather than satisfying. "I failed you as a father in every way that matters." Richard continued, his words tumbling out in a rush of panic and regret. "I let Margaret poison your childhood. I let Bella sabotage your opportunities. I stood by while they made you feel worthless and unwanted. And then I made it worse by casting you out at that wedding, like you were nothing, like 32 years of being my daughter meant absolutely nothing." Margaret seemed to realize that Richard's emotional display was her cue to join the desperate performance, sliding from her chair to kneel beside him with the kind of theatrical gesture that had always characterized her approach to family drama. The woman who had handed me that suitcase with such cold calculation now clasped her hands together in supplication, her carefully maintained appearance finally cracking to reveal something raw and terrified underneath. "I was jealous of you," she whispered, her voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear her. "From the time you were a little girl, I could see how smart you were, how independent and strong. You didn't need constant validation the way Bella did, and I told myself that meant you didn't need as much love or attention. Her words came faster now, as if she were afraid I might stop listening before she could finish her confession. "But the truth is that your strength scared me. I knew that if you ever realized your own worth, you would see through all of our weaknesses and pretensions. So I tried to keep you small to make you believe you were less than you were, because I was terrified of what you might become if you knew your own power." The psychological insight was probably accurate, but it felt calculated rather than genuine, as if Margaret had spent weeks preparing this explanation to present in exactly this moment. She had always been skilled at reading people and telling them what they wanted to hear, and even now, facing complete ruin, she was trying to manipulate me through carefully chosen admissions of guilt. But it was Bella's breakdown that struck me most powerfully, perhaps because her transformation had been the most complete. The golden daughter who had glided through life on waves of unearned praise and privilege now knelt before me with her face streaked with tears and her voice reduced to a broken whisper. "I destroyed you because I was afraid you would destroy me." She said her words barely audible through her sobs. "Every time you won an award or achieved something remarkable, I felt like I was disappearing. Mom and Dad praised me for breathing, but you actually earned every bit of recognition you received." Her confession continued in halting phrases interrupted by tears. "So I sabotaged you every chance I got. I hid your acceptance letters. I spread rumors about you. I made sure you were excluded from every social opportunity that might have helped you build confidence. I convinced myself it was self-preservation, but really it was just evil." The word evil hung in the air between us, and I could see that Bella meant it. She had finally recognized the true nature of her actions, understood that her systematic cruelty hadn't been justified by sibling rivalry or parental favoritism, but had been genuinely malicious in ways that had shaped my entire development as a person. "I stole your scholarship, your social life, your relationship with our parents, even your sense of self-worth." Bella continued, her voice growing stronger as she forced herself to confront the full scope of her crimes. "And I did it all while letting everyone believe I was the sweet, innocent sister who could do no wrong." The three of them knelt before me in the kitchen of the house that had witnessed so much of their cruelty, finally admitting to decades of systematic abuse and emotional terrorism. Their confessions were comprehensive and devastating, acknowledging not just individual incidents, but the calculated pattern of behavior that had defined my entire childhood and young adulthood. "We'll do anything," Richard said, his voice hoarse from crying. "We'll sell everything we have left. We'll work for the rest of our lives to pay back the money Margaret stole. We'll spend every day trying to make up for what we did to you. Just please don't destroy us completely. We're still your family, and somewhere underneath all the damage we do love you." Margaret nodded frantically, grasping at his words like a lifeline. "We can be different people, Evelyn. We can learn to be the family you deserved all along. It's not too late for us to change to become worthy of your forgiveness." Even Bella managed to speak through her tears. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to undo the damage I caused. I'll tell everyone the truth about what I did to you. I'll make sure the world knows that you were always the better daughter, the one who deserved everything they gave me instead." Their pleas filled the kitchen with desperate energy, three people who had never shown me genuine love now claiming they were capable of transformation and redemption. They offered me everything I had ever wanted to hear from them: acknowledgement, apology, the promise of better treatment, even the recognition that I had always been more deserving of their praise and attention. But forgiveness was never part of my plan. I looked at their tear-streaked faces, their desperate pleas still echoing in the kitchen air, and felt something cold and final settle in my chest. Standing slowly from my chair, I walked to the hallway closet where I had stored 3 suitcases the night before, anticipating this exact moment, with the same careful planning that had characterized every step of my campaign. "Your pleas are very moving," I said, returning to the kitchen with the luggage, "but they remind me of something that happened at a wedding reception not too long ago. Do you remember that night when you decided that family loyalty was less important than maintaining appearances?" I set the first suitcase down in front of Richard, watching his face crumble as he recognized the deliberate parallel I was drawing. This suitcase contained some clothes, basic toiletries, and a small amount of cash. Exactly what you thought I deserved when you cast me out in front of 200 witnesses. Richard's hands trembled as he stared at the black leather case, understanding immediately what was happening, but unable to process the complete reversal of power it represented. "Evelyn, please, you can't mean to—" "What I mean," I interrupted, placing the second suitcase in front of Margaret, "is that it's time for you to experience what you put me through. The humiliation, the rejection, the sudden realization that the people you thought loved you actually see you as disposable." Margaret's face had gone completely white, her carefully applied makeup now streaked with tears that made her look older and more fragile than I had ever seen her. "But we have nowhere to go," she whispered. "No money, no friends who will take us in. You're condemning us to homelessness." "I'm giving you exactly what you gave me," I replied, setting the third suitcase in front of Bella with deliberate ceremony. "A chance to build something new from nothing, to discover who you are when you can't rely on family wealth and social connections to define your identity." Bella stared at her suitcase as if it were a venomous snake, her voice barely audible when she spoke. "This is different. You were young and strong when we asked you to leave. We're older now. We don't have your resilience or your intelligence. We'll never survive what you survived." Her words contained an admission she probably hadn't intended, that they had always known I possessed strengths. They lacked qualities that had enabled me to thrive, despite their systematic cruelty. But recognition of my abilities hadn't led to respect or better treatment. Instead, it had motivated them to work harder to suppress and diminish me. "You're right that this is different," I said, walking to the front door and opening it wide so they could see the driveway beyond. "When you cast me out, I was innocent of any wrongdoing. I had never stolen from charities, never committed fraud, never deliberately sabotaged someone else's life. You, on the other hand, are facing criminal charges for decades of illegal behavior." The morning air that flowed through the open door carried the sounds of our affluent neighborhood lawnmowers, children playing the comfortable rhythms of suburban life that my family would no longer be able to access. I could see neighbors beginning their daily routines, unaware that they were about to witness the final act of a family drama that had captivated Greenwich for months. "Please." Richard tried one last time, his voice breaking with desperation. "We're begging you. Have mercy on us. Show us the forgiveness that we never showed you." I looked at him with the same cold assessment I had learned from years of boardroom negotiations, weighing his plea against the mountain of evidence Charles had collected about their cruelty. "Mercy is earned through genuine repentance and changed behavior over time. What you're asking for isn't mercy, it's immunity from consequences." "You learned that forgiveness has to be deserved." I continued repeating back words Margaret had spoken to me years earlier when I had begged her to forgive some minor childhood transgression. "You taught me that family loyalty works both ways, that respect has to be earned through actions rather than demanded through relationship." Margaret's gasp of recognition was audible as she realized I was using her own parenting philosophy against her applying the harsh lessons she had taught me throughout my childhood. The irony was perfect. She was finally experiencing the conditional love and earned acceptance she had always made me work for. "But we're family," Bella whispered, making one final appeal to the bond she had spent 3 decades undermining. "Blood is supposed to mean something." "You taught me that blood means nothing without love, respect, and basic human decency," I replied, opening each suitcase to show them the modest contents I had packed. "You spent 32 years proving that being related to someone doesn't obligate you to tolerate their abuse or protect them from consequences." The walk to the front door was a funeral procession, each of them carrying their suitcase with the defeated posture of people who had finally run out of options. Richard moved with the slow gait of a man who had aged decades in the span of months, while Margaret seemed to shrink with each step, her usual regal bearing replaced by the hunched shoulders of shame. Mrs. Patterson from next door was getting her mail when we emerged onto the front porch, and I could see the exact moment when she realized what she was witnessing. Her expression shifted from casual curiosity to fascination as she recognized the symbolic power of the Grace family being expelled from their own ancestral home. "Where will we go?" Margaret asked one final time, standing on the front walkway with her suitcase in hand, looking back at the house where she had reigned as mistress for over 30 years. "I suppose you'll figure it out," I replied, using the same dismissive tone she had employed at the wedding when my future had meant nothing to her. "You're resourceful people when you need to be. You managed to steal millions of dollars over the years. Surely you can figure out how to find a place to sleep." The neighbors who had witnessed my own banishment months earlier now watched from their windows and yards as the family that had once commanded their respect walked away from the Grace estate carrying everything they owned in 3 small suitcases. The symmetry was perfect, the justice complete, in ways that felt almost scriptural in their precision. Richard turned back once his face filled with the same desperate hope I had felt that night at the wedding when I had looked back at my family one last time. But there would be no last-minute reprieve, no moment of miraculous reconciliation that would restore them to their former positions. I watched them leave, with empty hands. The satisfaction of watching my family disappear down Elm Street with their suitcases was interrupted 3 days later by an unexpected call from Daniel, whose voice carried the kind of barely contained excitement that suggested he had uncovered something significant in Charles's legal labyrinth. His request to meet immediately at his office rather than discuss the matter over the phone indicated that whatever he had discovered was too sensitive or complex for casual conversation. When I arrived at Daniel's office that afternoon, I found him surrounded by documents that appeared to span decades, his desk covered with legal papers, sealed envelopes, and what looked like additional instructions from Charles that had been triggered by recent events. The methodical way he had organized the materials suggested he had been working through complex legal mechanisms that required careful sequencing and precise timing. "Charles left one final test," Daniel said without preamble, holding up a sealed letter bearing my grandfather's distinctive handwriting and marked with instructions that it should only be opened after the Grace family had been expelled from the house. This was hidden in a safety deposit box with instructions that it should only be activated if you successfully demonstrated the difference between justice and revenge by choosing proportional rather than maximum punishment. The letter Daniel handed me was written in Charles's careful script, but the tone was different from his previous communications, more formal, more legal in its precision, as if he had been dictating to attorneys rather than writing personal guidance for his granddaughter. The content was devastating in its implications for any remaining hope my family might have harbored about salvaging their situation. Upon Evelyn's successful completion of the loyalty test described in my previous instructions, the letter read, "The Grace family members shall be offered one final opportunity to retain access to the modest trust funds I have established for their basic living expenses. This opportunity requires a public acknowledgement of their treatment of Evelyn delivered in the form of a press conference to be held within 7 days of their expulsion from the family home." The specifics were humiliating in their precision. Charles required a full confession of their crimes and cruelties delivered before media representatives and community members with particular emphasis on their systematic emotional abuse of me throughout my childhood and young adulthood. Failure to complete this public apology would result in the permanent forfeiture of even the small monthly stipends Charles had grudgingly left them for survival purposes. He's requiring them to publicly destroy whatever dignity they have left, I said, amazed at the thoroughness of Charles's psychological warfare, even from beyond the grave. But here's where it gets interesting. Daniel continued, showing me additional documents that outlined the precise terms of the required apology. "The press conference must be voluntary. If all 3 family members don't agree to participate, then none of them can access the funds. Charles designed it so they would have to choose between solidarity and survival." "Saastain, sensae seien," Within 24 hours of Daniel's notification reaching my family at the motel where they had taken up residence, the divisions Charles had predicted began to appear. Bella, desperate and with no prospects for rebuilding her life, immediately agreed to the public humiliation if it meant access to even modest financial support. Richard and Margaret, clinging to whatever pride they had left, initially refused to participate in what they correctly recognized as a final degradation. But desperation has a way of overcoming pride, and by the end of the week, the prospect of complete destitution had changed their calculations. The press conference was scheduled for the following Tuesday at the Greenwich Community Center, a venue that ensured maximum attendance from the social circles that had once celebrated and now scorned the Grace family. The event itself was a masterpiece of public humiliation, attended by local media representatives, community leaders, and dozens of residents who had followed the Grace family scandal with fascination. Bella took the podium first, her voice shaking as she detailed her systematic sabotage of my academic and social opportunities, her manipulation of family dynamics to ensure she remained the favored daughter, and her recent attempt to fraudulently sell my house. Richard's confession focused on his business crimes, and his failure as a father delivered in the monotone voice of someone who had been broken by circumstances beyond his control. Margaret's contribution was perhaps most damaging as she described her embezzlement from children's charities and her deliberate campaign to undermine my self-worth throughout my childhood. The audience's reaction was exactly what Charles had intended, a mixture of shock at the scope of their crimes and disgust at their systematic cruelty toward me. Several people walked out during the confessions, apparently unable to stomach the details of child emotional abuse, while others took notes that would undoubtedly fuel gossip and social media discussions for months to come. When the press conference concluded, all three family members looked to me expectantly, apparently believing that their public self-destruction had earned them some form of forgiveness or reconciliation. The hope in their eyes was pathetic and desperate, the final vestige of people who still couldn't understand that their actions had consequences extending beyond whatever punishment they were willing to endure. I stood up, slowly walked to the podium they had just vacated, and addressed both my family and the assembled crowd with the calm authority I had learned from months of wielding power over people who had once controlled every aspect of my life. I want everyone here to understand that I do not accept these apologies. I said, my voice carrying clearly through the community center's sound system. Not because they weren't comprehensive or because they weren't delivered with apparent sincerity, but because apologies are meaningless without the opportunity for changed behavior, and these people will never again be in positions where they can demonstrate genuine repentance. The silence that followed was complete, broken only by the sound of cameras clicking as photographers documented what they correctly recognized as the final act of a family drama that had captivated their community for months. Justice isn't about forgiveness or reconciliation. I continued looking directly at my family as I spoke. Justice is about appropriate consequences, about ensuring that actions have meanings that extend beyond the comfort of the people who commit them. These confessions don't undo 32 years of emotional abuse. They don't restore the opportunities that were stolen from me. They don't heal the damage that was inflicted on a child who deserved love and protection. I could see tears forming in Bella's eyes as she realized that even this ultimate humiliation wouldn't restore her to my good graces or provide her with the forgiveness she desperately craved. Richard and Margaret simply stared at the floor, finally understanding that there would be no redemption arc, no moment of reconciliation that would allow them to rebuild their relationship with me. They had bowed their heads, but I wanted more than that. The aftermath of the press conference marked the beginning of Bella's descent into a kind of invisibility that I had once known intimately, though I learned about her circumstances only through the occasional reports that filtered back through Helen's network of contacts throughout New England. The golden daughter, who had once commanded attention simply by entering a room, had been reduced to the kind of person society looked through, rather than at a transformation so complete that it felt almost mythical in its precision. 6 months after that humiliating public confession, Bella had relocated to a small industrial town in western Massachusetts, far enough from Greenwich to escape the immediate recognition that made normal life impossible but close enough that she occasionally encountered people who remembered the Grace family scandal from news coverage or social media. She had taken a job cleaning office buildings at night work that paid minimum wage and required her to be invisible during business hours, moving through corporate spaces like a ghost, while the professional world slept. The woman who had never worked a day in her privileged life now spent her evenings emptying trash cans, scrubbing toilets, and vacuuming carpets in anonymous office buildings where her former social peers conducted the kind of business meetings she had once attended as decoration on her husband's arm. Her hands, which had never known calluses or chemical burns, became rough and red from industrial cleaning supplies, while her back ached from hours spent bent over tasks that would have been unimaginable during her years of leisure and luxury. During the day, she worked at a truck stop diner just off Interstate 90, serving coffee and eggs to travelers who never looked at her face long enough to recognize the woman whose wedding had been featured in Society magazines just 2 years earlier. The polyester uniform and hairnet that were required for food service work completed her transformation from social butterfly to invisible service worker, the kind of person she had spent her entire life looking through rather than seeing. The psychological impact of this transformation was devastating in ways that went beyond mere financial hardship. Bella had built her entire identity around being admired, desired, and envied by others, and the complete absence of that attention created a void that no amount of honest work could fill. She would catch glimpses of herself in the mirrors of the office buildings she cleaned, seeing a tired woman in a janitor's uniform who bore only passing resemblance to the radiant bride who had once believed herself destined for a fairy tale life. But the cruelest torture was the way news of my success continued to reach her, despite her attempts to avoid reminders of her former life. Local newspapers occasionally featured articles about my transformation of the Grace estate into a women's support center, my growing influence in Connecticut philanthropic circles, and my emergence as a respected voice on issues of family justice and emotional abuse recovery. These articles always included photographs that showed me in designer clothing, surrounded by community leaders and successful professionals living the life of influence and respect that Bella had always assumed would be hers. The contrast was unbearable. While I appeared in newspapers as a symbol of triumph over adversity, speaking at conferences and funding charitable initiatives, Bella scraped grease off industrial grills and mopped floors in buildings where security guards made sure she never lingered in public areas during business hours. The rage that consumed her during those moments of recognition was pure and helpless, the fury of someone who understood that her circumstances were both deserved and irreversible. She tried during her first year of exile to make contact with me through various intermediaries, writing letters that were returned unopened and attempting phone calls that were blocked by assistants who had been instructed never to put her through. Her desperation led her to approach former mutual acquaintances during her rare trips back to Connecticut for legal proceedings. But these encounters only reinforced her new status as a social pariah who made people uncomfortable simply by acknowledging shared history. The most painful rejection came when she attempted to approach me directly at a charity event in Hartford, where I was being honored for my philanthropic work. Security personnel, recognizing her as someone who had been specifically banned from the venue due to her criminal history, escorted her out before she could get within speaking distance. The humiliation of being physically removed from an event where her former victim was being celebrated as a community leader crystallized everything she had lost and everything she would never regain. As months turned into years, Bella's attempts to reconnect became less frequent and more desperate, reduced to social media messages that went unanswered and occasional letters sent to my business address that disappeared into the void of professional gatekeepers who had been trained to protect my time and attention from exactly these kinds of intrusions. She began to understand that her existence had become irrelevant to my life in ways that went beyond mere dismissal or rejection. I had achieved something that felt almost supernatural in its completeness. I had made her disappear, not through destruction or punishment, but through the simple act of refusing to acknowledge her continued existence. She could read about my successes, see photographs of my achievements, even observe me from a distance during public appearances. but she had been rendered as invisible to me as I had once been to her. The symmetry was perfect and devastating. The woman who had spent 30 years making me feel like I didn't matter, who had sabotaged my opportunities and poisoned my relationships while basking in unearned praise and attention, now experienced the existential terror of being genuinely forgotten by the person whose opinion mattered most to her sense of self. She finally knew what it felt like to be deleted. While Bella's exile had been dramatic in its completeness, Margaret's destruction unfolded with a different kind of cruelty, the slow suffocation of a woman whose entire identity had been built around social status and community recognition. Unlike her daughter, who had at least possessed youth and physical beauty as potential assets for rebuilding, Margaret faced her downfall as a woman in her 60s, whose only marketable skills had been charm manipulation and the ability to organize charity events that were no longer available to her. The social death began with the small humiliations that might have seemed trivial to outside observers, but were devastating to someone who had spent decades carefully curating her public image. The weekly bridge games that had been a cornerstone of her social calendar for over 20 years simply stopped including her, with longtime friends claiming scheduling conflicts rather than admitting they no longer wanted to associate with a known embezzler. The charity committees that had once competed for her participation now treated her name like a contagion, quietly removing her from mailing lists and event invitations without explanation or ceremony. But it was the everyday encounters that truly broke her spirit. Shopping for groceries at the upscale markets where she had once held court among Greenwich's elite became an exercise in public shame as former friends literally turned away rather than acknowledge her presence. Margaret, who had spent her adult life perfecting the art of social navigation, found herself unable to complete simple errands without facing whispered comments and barely concealed contempt from people who had once competed for her attention and approval. The financial constraints of her new reality forced her into spaces she had previously considered beneath her notice. The discount stores and chain restaurants that had been invisible to her during her years of privilege now became her primary shopping destinations, places where her presence felt like a daily reminder of how far she had fallen from her former status. She would catch glimpses of herself in security mirrors, seeing a woman in discount clothing pushing a cart through aisles she had never imagined entering, her carefully maintained appearance slowly deteriorating under the weight of financial stress and social isolation. The apartment she now occupied was a one-bedroom unit in a complex that housed mostly elderly residents living on fixed incomes, a far cry from the gracious homes where she had once entertained Connecticut's social elite. Her neighbors were retired teachers, postal workers, and factory employees. Decent people whom Margaret had never learned to see as fully human during her years of privilege. The cognitive dissonance of finding herself living among people she had always considered her social inferiors created a constant state of psychological discomfort that manifested in depression and anxiety. After 18 months of this exile, Margaret's desperation finally overcame her remaining pride, leading her to make the journey back to Greenwich in a desperate attempt to see me. She had convinced herself that enough time had passed for my anger to cool, that maternal bonds might eventually overcome the justified resentment I had harbored for so many years. Her plan was pathetic in its optimism. She would apologize more sincerely than she had at the press conference, perhaps cry authentically enough to trigger whatever sympathy I might still possess for the woman who had given birth to me. I was leaving the women's support center I had established in the Grace family home when Margaret approached me on the sidewalk, her appearance so transformed by hardship that I almost didn't recognize her. The woman who had once carried herself with regal bearing now moved with the hesitant steps of someone accustomed to rejection. Her clothing clean, but clearly inexpensive, her hair styled at a chain salon rather than the exclusive Greenwich establishments that had once catered to her vanity. "Evelyn," she said, her voice carrying the tremulous quality of someone who had practiced this conversation many times but still feared the outcome. "I know I don't have the right to ask for your time, but I've been hoping we could talk. I need you to understand how sorry I am for everything I did to hurt you." I looked at her with the same clinical detachment I might bring to evaluating a business proposal, noting the desperation in her eyes and the way her hands shook slightly as she spoke. The woman who had once dismissed my achievements and ignored my pain now stood before me as a supplicant seeking the kind of attention and validation she had withheld from me throughout my childhood. "I've had 32 years to understand exactly how sorry you are," I replied, my voice carrying none of the warmth she was obviously hoping to kindle. "Your sorrow seems to correlate perfectly with your circumstances. When you had everything you wanted, my feelings didn't matter to you at all." Margaret's face crumpled as she heard the flat rejection in my tone, but she pressed forward with the desperate determination of someone who had nothing left to lose. "I know I was a terrible mother to you. I know I failed you in every way that mattered. But I'm begging you to find some small piece of forgiveness in your heart. I'm your mother and I love you, and I need you to help me understand how to make this right." The word love coming from her lips after decades of casual cruelty was almost laughable in its transparent manipulation. She had never shown me love when it would have cost her nothing, never defended me when I was being mistreated, never celebrated my achievements or comforted my disappointments. But now, when she needed something from me, she suddenly discovered maternal affection that had been mysteriously absent throughout my entire development. "You don't love me," I said, stepping closer so she could see the complete absence of warmth in my eyes. "You love the idea of having a successful daughter who might restore some of your lost status. You love the possibility that I might rescue you from the consequences of your own choices. But you have never loved me as a person because you have never seen me as fully human." The truth of my words hit her like a physical blow, and she began to cry with the kind of desperate sobbing that might have moved me to pity if I hadn't spent my entire childhood watching her reserve that kind of emotional expression for her own disappointments while remaining cold and distant during mine. "Please," she whispered through her tears. "I'll do anything. I'll spend the rest of my life making up for what I did to you. Just don't leave me with nothing. Don't let me disappear completely." I studied her tear-streaked face, seeing not the mother who had failed me, but simply another person who wanted something from me that I was not obligated to provide. The power dynamic that had defined our relationship for over 3 decades had been completely inverted. But that didn't create any obligation for me to use my position to heal wounds that she had inflicted through deliberate cruelty. "Now you know what it feels like to be invisible," I said, turning away from her without another word, leaving her standing alone on the sidewalk where she had once commanded respect and attention from everyone who encountered her. Her breakdown was complete and public, her sobs echoing down the street where neighbors who had once competed for her approval now watched from their windows as she fell apart in full view of the community that had rejected her. But the tears that had once been weapons she used to manipulate family dynamics and social situations no longer carried any power to change circumstances or influence outcomes. Her tears no longer meant anything. Margaret's collapse on the Greenwich sidewalk had been witnessed by enough people to ensure that news of her breakdown reached Richard within hours, but his response revealed the complete extent to which his own circumstances had deteriorated beyond any ability to help his wife or himself. The federal investigation that had been quietly building around his business practices for over a year had finally reached the stage where criminal charges were not just possible, but inevitable, transforming him from a respected businessman into a defendant whose every financial transaction was being scrutinized by prosecutors eager to make an example of white-collar crime. The investigation had begun with the evidence I had provided through Helen's network, but it had quickly expanded as federal agents discovered that Richard's illegal activities extended far beyond the property fraud and investor deception we had initially documented. His business empire, which had appeared legitimate from the outside, was revealed to be a complex web of shell companies, fraudulent loans, and money laundering schemes that had been operating for over a decade with increasing boldness and sophistication. The most damaging blow to Richard's remaining dignity came when his former business partners began cooperating with federal investigators in exchange for reduced sentences or immunity from prosecution. Marcus Whitfield, who had once been Richard's closest professional ally, provided detailed testimony about Richard's pattern of forging documents, misrepresenting property values, and using client funds for personal expenses. The betrayal was complete and strategic, with each former associate racing to provide evidence against Richard before their own culpability could be fully established. James Morrison, who had invested millions in Richard's development projects, testified that Richard had knowingly sold him properties with falsified appraisals and hidden environmental problems that would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to remediate. Patricia Blackwood revealed that Richard had used her charitable foundation as a front for money laundering operations, accepting illegal payments through fake donation schemes that had put her own reputation and freedom at risk. The picture that emerged from these testimonies was of a man who had spent years systematically defrauding anyone who trusted him, from major investors to small charitable organizations, all while maintaining the facade of a respected community leader. The scope of his crimes was breathtaking in its audacity and devastating in its impact on the dozens of victims who had believed they were dealing with an honorable businessman. Richard's legal representation, which had once consisted of prestigious white-shoe law firms that charged premium rates for their discretion and expertise, had been reduced to a single overworked public defender after his assets were frozen by federal marshals. The attorney assigned to his case was competent but overwhelmed, handling dozens of similar cases with neither the time nor the resources to mount the kind of aggressive defense that might have been possible during Richard's wealthier days. The professional destruction extended beyond the courtroom into every aspect of Richard's former business life. The Connecticut Business Association, where he had once served on the board of directors, expelled him with a statement denouncing his pattern of fraudulent behavior that violated every principle of ethical business conduct. The Greenwich Chamber of Commerce removed his photograph from their wall of honored members, while the various charitable organizations that had once competed for his donations issued press releases distancing themselves from his criminal activities. But perhaps most devastating was the complete collapse of his professional reputation within the real estate and investment communities where he had spent 30 years building relationships and credibility. His name had become synonymous with fraud and betrayal, a cautionary tale told in business schools and professional conferences about the dangers of unchecked greed and the inevitable consequences of criminal behavior in financial markets. I learned about the full extent of his ruin through Daniel's continued monitoring of the legal proceedings, which had become a matter of professional interest, given the civil lawsuits that various victims were filing against Richard's remaining assets. The man who had once commanded respect in boardrooms and country club dining rooms was now spending his days in a cramped apartment in Hartford, preparing for a trial that would almost certainly end with a prison sentence measured in decades rather than years. When I finally encountered him again, it was outside the federal courthouse where he had been attending a hearing about asset forfeiture proceedings. Richard looked like a man who had aged 20 years in the span of months, his once proud bearing replaced by the hunched shoulders of defeat and the careful movements of someone who had learned to expect hostility from every quarter. He saw me approaching from across the courthouse plaza and stopped walking, apparently uncertain whether to flee or attempt some kind of reconciliation. The decision was made for him when I continued my approach with the confident stride of someone who had no reason to fear any encounter with a broken man who no longer possessed any power to harm anyone. "Hello, Dad," I said, noting how he flinched slightly at the casual way I addressed him, as if the word "Dad" had become a weapon rather than a term of familial affection. "Evelyn," he replied, his voice carrying none of the authority it had once possessed. "I suppose you've heard about the legal troubles." "I've heard about the criminal charges, the cooperating witnesses, and the asset forfeiture," I corrected, watching his face register the comprehensive nature of my knowledge about his situation. "I've also heard that you're facing 40 to 60 years in federal prison." The numbers hit him like physical blows, and I could see him struggle to maintain even the pretense of dignity in the face of such overwhelming consequences. This was the man who had spent my entire childhood making me feel small and worthless, who had dismissed my achievements and ignored my pain, who had finally cast me out of the family with casual cruelty that suggested my existence had never mattered to him at all. "I know you have every right to hate me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I failed you in every way that mattered. But I need you to know that seeing what I've become, facing what I'm about to lose, has made me understand how wrong I was about everything that truly matters in life." I looked at him with the same analytical detachment I might bring to evaluating a business proposal, weighing his words against the lifetime of evidence I possessed about his character and priorities. The recognition he claimed to have achieved about what truly mattered had come only when everything else had been stripped away, only when consequences had finally caught up with choices he had made freely and repeatedly over the course of decades. "What you're experiencing isn't recognition," I told him. "It's just fear. You're not sorry about the damage you caused. You're sorry that you got caught and that you're going to pay the price for your choices." The truth of my assessment was visible in his expression, and he seemed to deflate even further as he realized that even his final attempt at seeking forgiveness had been seen through and rejected. The man who once despised me now had nothing left. Walking away from Richard outside that courthouse, I felt something shift inside me that went beyond mere satisfaction or closure. The campaign of justice that had consumed my life for over a year was finally complete, but instead of the emptiness I had expected to feel once my enemies were defeated, I found myself filled with a sense of purpose that was both unexpected and transformative. The Grace family estate, which had once been a monument to their cruelty and my suffering, was about to become something entirely different. The transformation began with practical considerations, but evolved into something that honored both Charles's memory and the lessons he had tried to teach me about the difference between destruction and creation. Using the offshore funds he had left me, I began converting the house into the Charles Grace Center for Family Justice, a residential facility designed to help women and children escape situations of emotional abuse and financial manipulation, similar to what I had endured throughout my childhood. The main living areas where Margaret had once entertained Connecticut's elite became group therapy spaces and meeting rooms where trained counselors helped residents process trauma and develop strategies for rebuilding their lives. Charles's study, where he had taught me about patience and strategic thinking, was converted into a library focused on legal resources and self-advocacy training, equipped with computers and research materials that would help women understand their rights and options. The master bedroom suite that had symbolized my parents' authority became a child care facility where the children of residents could feel safe and valued, while their mothers worked on healing and planning for independent futures. Even Bella's former room was repurposed as a workshop space where residents learned practical skills like financial literacy, resume writing, and job interview techniques that would help them achieve economic independence. But the most meaningful transformation was psychological rather than physical. The house that had once echoed with my childhood loneliness and adult rage was now filled with the sounds of women discovering their own strength and children laughing without fear. The dining room where I had eaten so many silent meals while being ignored by my family now hosted community dinners where every voice was heard and every story was validated. The opening ceremony for the center, held on a crisp October morning exactly 2 years after that devastating wedding reception, was attended by community leaders, journalists, and over 100 women who had already benefited from the programs we offered. Helen Morrison covered the event for several publications, but her most important contribution was the comprehensive interview she conducted with me for a national magazine focused on family justice and abuse recovery. The interview, published under the title "From Invisible Daughter to Advocate for Change," detailed my entire journey from childhood scapegoat to empowered advocate, but it focused primarily on the lessons I had learned about transforming personal pain into community healing. Helen's skillful questioning helped me articulate how my experience with systematic family abuse had prepared me to recognize and address similar patterns in other women's lives. "The most important thing I learned," I told Helen during our conversation in Charles's former study, "is that justice isn't about making other people suffer the way you suffered. True justice is about ensuring that the conditions that allowed your suffering to occur are changed so that others don't have to endure what you endured." The response to the article was overwhelming, with letters and emails pouring in from women across the country who recognized their own experiences in my story. Many of them shared their own accounts of family scapegoating, financial abuse, and systematic emotional manipulation, creating a network of survivors who had found their voices through seeing their experiences validated in a national publication. Some of these women came to stay at the center, but many more were inspired to seek help in their own communities or to begin advocating for changes in their own family dynamics. The ripple effect was exactly what Charles had hoped to achieve through his careful planning, not just justice for one person, but systemic change that would protect vulnerable family members from the kind of abuse that had defined my childhood. That evening, after the last visitors had left and the house had settled into the peaceful quiet that had become its new normal, I found myself drawn once again to Charles's wooden box, which I had kept in my private office as a reminder of the journey that had brought me to this moment. Inside the box, underneath the familiar papers and mementos, I discovered something I had somehow overlooked during all my previous examinations: a small photograph tucked into a corner fold of the velvet lining. The picture showed Charles and me together in his garden when I was perhaps 10 years old, both of us smiling at something beyond the camera's view. I was holding a small plant we had just transplanted, and he was pointing toward a section of the garden where we had been working together. What struck me about the image was the expression on both our faces, not the strained politeness that characterized most family photographs, but genuine joy in shared purpose and mutual affection. On the back of the photograph, in Charles's distinctive handwriting, was a note I had never seen before. The most important seeds are planted not in gardens, but in hearts. Watch Evelyn grow into the woman who will plant justice where cruelty once flourished. The prophetic nature of his words took my breath away. He had known, even when I was just a child struggling with my family's rejection, that my pain would eventually become the foundation for something larger and more meaningful than personal revenge. He had seen in me not just a victim to be protected, but a future advocate who would use her own healing to help others find their way to freedom and dignity. Standing in the house that had once been a prison of emotional abuse and was now a sanctuary for healing and empowerment, I finally understood the full scope of what Charles had given me. It wasn't just money or property or even the tools for revenge. It was the example of how to transform suffering into service, how to use power responsibly, and how to ensure that justice served a purpose larger than personal satisfaction. The Grace Center for Family Justice would continue to grow and serve women for decades to come, funded by the fortune Charles had protected for me and staffed by people who understood that true healing required both individual therapy and systemic change. My story would continue to inspire others to speak out against family abuse and demand accountability from people who had wielded their power carelessly and cruelly. As I locked the front door of the center that night and walked to my car, I thought about all the doors that had been closed to me throughout my childhood, and the new doors that were now opening for women who had found their way to this place of healing and hope. I closed the door behind me and opened up a new world. Ending, a call to action. And so ends the story of Evelyn Grace, a woman who transformed 32 years of family cruelty into a legacy of justice and healing. Her journey reminds us that sometimes the greatest victories come not from destroying our enemies, but from building something beautiful from the ashes of our pain. This story shows us that patience truly is power, that justice delayed is not always justice denied, and that the seeds of our greatest triumphs are often planted in the soil of our deepest suffering. Evelyn's grandfather Charles understood that true strength comes not from immediate retaliation, but from strategic patience and the wisdom to know when and how to act. The Grace Center for Family Justice continues to operate today, helping hundreds of women and children escape the cycle of emotional abuse and financial manipulation. Evelyn's story has inspired legislation protecting family members from systematic exclusion and has become a case study in business schools and law schools across the country. As for Richard, Margaret, and Bella, Richard served 15 years in federal prison before his death from a heart attack at age 78. Margaret lived out her remaining days in a subsidized housing facility forgotten by the society that had once celebrated her. Bella eventually found work as a night shift security guard in a warehouse outside Boston, her identity so thoroughly erased that even her former classmates wouldn't recognize the broken woman she became. But this story isn't really about revenge, is it? It's about the power of transformation, the importance of patience, and the truth that justice, when it finally arrives, is always worth the wait. What did you think of Evelyn's journey? Have you ever experienced family favoritism or emotional abuse that made you feel invisible in your own home? Have you learned the power of patience in your own battles for justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because your story matters just as much as Evelyn's did. If this story moved you, if it made you think about justice and family dynamics in a new way, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We share true stories like this one every week, stories about ordinary people who found extraordinary strength when life pushed them to their breaking point. And remember, if you're currently facing family abuse or systematic mistreatment, you don't have to wait for justice to find you. There are resources available, support networks ready to help, and people who understand that your pain is real and your worth is not determined by how others choose to treat you. Sometimes the best revenge is not revenge at all, but the decision to build something better than what tried to break you. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not to destroy your enemies, but to make their opinions of you completely irrelevant to your success and happiness. Thank you for listening to Evelyn's story. Thank you for understanding that justice, like all good things, is worth waiting for when it finally arrives in its full and perfect form. Until next time, remember that your story matters, your pain is valid, and your future is still being written by your choices, not by the people who tried to diminish your light. Subscribe, comment, and keep believing that justice will always find a way.